A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I ordered sunlight off the internet, a bold decision driven by desperation. Living in the perpetual gloom of a small apartment in a city that rarely saw blue skies had taken its toll on my mental health, and my wife, Emma, was fading along with my spirit, her laughter diminishing until it was but a distant memory echoing off the cold, concrete walls that enclosed us. One evening, while desperately browsing through the dimly lit corners of the web, I stumbled upon a bizarre website, its layout crude yet oddly captivating, that claimed to sell pure sunlight packed in airtight containers that promised a burst of warmth and brilliance right to your living room. Skepticism gnawed at me, but curiosity proved stronger. I clicked through testimonials describing the miraculous effects of bottled sunlight, transforming pallid rooms into golden havens, reviving joy, clarity, and even productivity. With my heart racing, I ordered not just one container, but two, convinced that this was the answer to our depressive existence. Days passed slowly, but at last, the yellowed package arrived on our doorstep as rain pattered down relentlessly, a cruel reminder of what lay outside. I tore it open. Inside was a glass jar filled with a shimmering, almost pulsating yellow light. My pulse quickened as I set the jar on our kitchen table, unsealing it with a dramatic flourish, and the moment I did, a warmth flooded the air, cradling us in a gentle embrace that felt surreal. Emma teetered into the room, her eyes widening, and for the first time in too long, I saw a flicker of hope flicker in her gaze. We sat together, mesmerized, as the light wrapped around us somehow tasting like nostalgia, awakening feelings we had lost, the joyous sunlight of summers past, and for hours we basked, laughing and dreaming, drawing shades of golden memories from the depths of our minds. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice small changes in Emma. Her laughter was still vibrant, but it also bore an eerie undertone, like a misplayed note in a perfect melody. She started to speak of visions, grand rolling fields bathed in eternal sunshine, the laughter of people she had never met, and an urgency in her voice as she talked about leaving our apartment, about stepping into a world she claimed was just beyond our door, a world that felt eerily familiar yet foreign. I brushed off her ramblings at first, attributing them to the oddity of sudden brightness in her life. After all, sunlight was supposed to uplift, not unsettle. But soon, I couldn't ignore the creeping dread clawing at my insides, especially when Emma began to withdraw, retreating into herself, the light in her eyes dimming just as quickly as it had sparked to life, replaced by an uncanny stillness. It was frighteningly tangible, like watching a mirror crack slowly, fracturing our shared reality. She spoke less and less about us, instead emulating 1,000 untold stories behind her sun-soaked gaze, and I scoured the internet for any sign of the product, desperate to understand, only to find reviews vanishing and the website itself gone without a trace. In a fit of panic, I confronted her one night, demanding to know what was happening, and she smiled, but there was something dark under the surface, a glimpse behind her eyes that sparked primal fear. "The light is talking to me," she whispered, voice low and haunting. "It wants me to come back, to join it," and in that moment, I felt the cold flash slice through me, a realization that the sunlight hadn't just illuminated our apartment but had somehow seeped beyond and twisted reality, beckoning her towards something I couldn't perceive, but sensed in the depths of my bones. That night, she disappeared, leaving only the jar behind, still pulsing with that diabolical warmth, and I was left staring at it, utter terror washing over me as I realized too late that I hadn't just ordered sunlight, I had opened a portal to something beyond comprehension, a trap designed to ensnare the unwitting. And as I sat there in our empty apartment, the darkness creeping back like a long-forgotten friend, I heard her voice call from the distance, sweet and beckoning, telling me in that same twisted, cheerful tone that there was a place to join her, a vibrant world of unending light, and that we could finally be happy again if only I would let go and step into the sunshine. Ever since I was a kid, I had a morbid fascination with the deep end of the pool. It was always more than just water to me, it felt alive, humming with secrets, each ripple a whisper begging to be explored. My parents insisted on having swim lessons every summer, and while other kids splashed around carelessly, I would find myself drawn to the chilling depths, where the sunlight fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards, illuminating a world that felt both beautiful and horrifying. On the last day of lessons, I dove to the bottom, my hands grazing the rough, plastered wall beneath the surface, when I noticed something strange, a hint of movement flickered just beyond my reach. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but a dark shape darted away, vanishing into the shadows, leaving me breathless and captivated. I never spoke of it, convinced it was just a trick of the light until the summer of my 16th birthday, when my friends and I threw a wild, reckless party, complete with loud music and laughter echoing into the night. As the hours passed, the younger one splashed around in the shallow end, while I lingered at the edge of the deep end, longing to dive back into that mysterious realm. I was drunk on adrenaline and curiosity when I finally succumbed to temptation, plunging into the cool water, my heart racing as I sank deeper, the world above fading into distant echoes. Suddenly, I felt a sense of urgency pulling me down, and I had this unshakable sensation that something, or someone, was guiding me. My fingertips grazed the slippery tiles of the bottom, and then I saw her, an apparition with long, flowing hair that floated eerily in the water, her pale face reflecting an otherworldly brightness. She looked at me with haunting eyes full of sorrow, and I couldn't scream even if I wanted to. I was frozen by a strange mix of fear and fascination as she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, sending an electric jolt through my body. Just then, my friends began to worry and jumped in to pull me up, breaking the spell she had over me. When I resurfaced, gasping for air, she was nowhere to be found, as if she'd slipped through the cracks of existence. I wanted to tell my friends what I had seen, but the look of horror on their faces when they pulled me from the depths made me swallow my words. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the vision of her from my mind. I began to research the lore surrounding pools in my town, and what I discovered sent chills racing down my spine. There were whispers about a girl who had drowned at the local pool decades ago, an incident shrouded in tragedy that had been barely mentioned in the town's history. They said she waited for someone to free her, trapped in the water's depths, her spirit forever caught between worlds. But my friends dismissed my findings as drunken ramblings, they just wanted to have fun. So, I took it upon myself to return to the pool alone at night, drawn by an overwhelming urge I couldn't explain. The water was strangely calm, lit only by the ghostly glow of moonlight, and as I sat at the edge of the deep end, I felt her presence again, an intoxicating energy swirling around me. I took a deep breath and plunged in, this time with purpose, sinking down to the bottom where I felt her waiting, somehow familiar, her sorrowful gaze locking onto mine. I closed my eyes, feeling her hands wrap around my wrists, pulling me closer, as if inviting me into her watery world. But as I felt the cold grip of despair tighten, a surge of instinct made me fight against the pull. I wasn't ready to join her, but her grip was surprisingly strong. For the first time, I heard her voice, a soft murmur echoing in my mind, begging for release and companionship, drowning me in a flood of anguish. "Help me," she implored, her breath brushing against my skin like a soft caress, awakening a deep-seated loneliness within me that I couldn't deny. I struggled to break free, but every attempt only seemed to draw me in further. The pressure shifted, blurring the lines of reality until I couldn't tell where I ended, and she began. Just then, the water above erupted into chaos as my friends began splashing around, their laughter disturbing her haunting lullaby, and in that moment of distraction, I broke away, shooting towards the surface. I gasped for air, my heart pounding like a drum, but the weight of her plea lingered, scaring me more than the idea of drowning itself. The next night, I returned again, but this time I was armed with resolve. I had to know her story, to understand why she was trapped in that in-between state. I slipped into the water, the coolness wrapping around me like a shroud, and as I ventured deeper, I called out to her, unsure of what I expected. For a moment, silence prevailed, but then I felt her, a gentle stirring in the water, and there she was, eyes brimming with sadness, fingers beckoning me closer. "Have you come to set me free?" she whispered, her voice like the sound of bubbles bursting softly in the water. I hesitated before nodding, my heart racing as I swam closer. As we held each other's gaze, I felt her pain seep into me, filling me with the weight of her grief. She had been a child at the time, vibrant and full of life, swallowed whole by the darkness beneath the surface. I saw flashes of her memories, laughter with friends, sunbathing with her family, and the horrifying moment when she slipped and drowned, the last face she saw being a lifeguard who could only watch helplessly as she sunk to the bottom. I understood then, she wasn't just a ghost, she was a victim, trapped in a cycle of torment, yearning for freedom but unable to let go of the world above. Tears streamed from her eyes as she reached out again, and I felt a tidal pull of sorrow rising within me, battling my instinct to flee. "Help me forget," she begged, and my chest tightened as I realized, to free her, I had to take her pain into myself, to drown in her memories until she could ascend beyond the water. I was terrified, but something inside me longed to protect her, to ease her never-ending suffering. I took a deep breath, nodding solemnly, surrendering to the depths once more, and as I enveloped myself in her essence, the world around me faded away. She held me tightly, and I felt both of us sinking deeper into darkness until it all began to blur. The past, the present, everything melded into a void that offered me comfort wrapped in despair. In those final moments, I became aware of a darkness unfurling within me like petals opening in a withering flower, the pain of 100 lifetimes coursing through my veins, all in the name of setting her free. I can't tell how long we lingered in that dark expanse, but the moment her essence finally split from mine, I erupted from the water in a gasp, struggling to breathe, a sense of loss strangling my heart. She was gone, but a part of her would live on within me, embedded in my very being. Though she was at peace, I was left behind, forever changed and marked by the sorrow of the girl who had lived in the deep end of the pool, just a shadow in the water, a wistful reminder that some stories are never truly finished but instead linger in the quiet depths of our memories, haunting us in the stillness of night when we least expect it, keeping watch just beyond the surface, waiting for someone else brave enough to dive into the unknown. When I was a child, the sight of my grandfather filling the ice bucket at motels was as familiar to me as the sound of his weathered voice telling stories by the fireplace. Each time we took our annual road trip across the country, we would pull into a roadside motel, and while other guests would casually settle into their rooms, Grandpa would march straight to the ice machine, each time filling the bucket to the brim with crashing cubes, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, never once explaining his curious habit despite my persistent inquiries, brushing them off with a smile, as if he believed the mystery would add to the charm. Years later, after his passing, I found myself driving to the same old motel, nostalgia thick in the air, longing to relive those simpler times, ignoring the warning signs that flickered like ghosts. The motel looked as if it had aged along with him, faded paint peeling from the walls, a lingering damp smell in the hallway. As I unlocked the door, the hinges creaked in protest, and every inch of the small room seemed to echo the memories of who I once was and who he was to me. As I settled in, I couldn't shake off the urge to fill that ice bucket just like he always did, so, without hesitation, I found myself trudging down to the grimy common area. The ice machine clanked and wheezed, and with each scoop, I felt a thrill, an odd connection to my grandfather. However, as I turned to head back, I noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway, obscured in shadows, a tall man dressed in a shabby coat, head bowed, and as I tried to catch a glimpse of his face, he turned abruptly and vanished into the darkness, a chill creeping down my spine, yet I quickly dismissed it as my overactive imagination, returning to my room, igniting my laptop, and planning how to commemorate Grandpa. That's when I stumbled across an old family photo album filled with snapshots of his younger days, yet one particular photo caught my eye. A grainy image of him standing outside a motel that I didn't recognize, the door flung open wide, giving the sense that something sinister had recently occurred. I scrutinized the details, his smile seemed distorted, eyes darting with a hint of panic, and in the corner, faintly, I could make out another figure, a blurry shadow, and I felt my gut twist as an icy hand gripped my heart, the unease from earlier bubbling up again. I spent the next hour ensnared in the album, and something odd pulled at my memory. Stories he used to tell, vague warnings about not opening doors without checking who was on the other side, a conditioned response that seemed all too prescient now, as if he had a deep-rooted fear that extended beyond typical parental concern. With every flick of the page, I overheard him narrating how encounters with strangers can shift moods from serene hopefulness to grim horror in a split second, gripping me tightly in the haunting web of his unspoken fears, as if he knew that something dark loomed over these forgotten motels. Restless, I peered out the window, looking for the figure I had seen earlier, but the outside world remained shrouded in thick night, the only illumination coming from a flickering street lamp that danced like it was caught in a ghostly waltz, and it was then when I began to feel that familiar urge wash over me, to fill the ice bucket again, driven not just by nostalgia but by an instinctual need to prepare for something unnameable. Refilling the bucket, I paused, suddenly recalling Grandpa's uncharacteristic fervor and insisting I always stay close, never let the night creep in too closely. But when I looked back at the door, I noticed something peculiar, a wedge of light creeping through the threshold, and my heart pounded as I slowly edged toward it, breath catching in my throat. That dreaded instinct he taught me clawed at my mind, and so I braced myself, throwing the door open wide with a flourish. Nothing but the chilling emptiness of the hallway met my gaze, but a door adjacent to mine stood slightly ajar, invitingly beckoning, and despite my apprehensions, I felt compelled to investigate. The moment I stepped over the threshold, I was hit by an oppressive stillness, the air thick and stifling as though the room was holding its breath, and in the far corner, illuminated by the flickering lamp, stood a large ice bucket, filled to the brim, overturned and spilling like a broken promise, causing shards of ice to glisten sinisterly against the carpet, and before I could process what I was seeing, that same shadow figure emerged from the bathroom, and in horror, I realized it was the exact man I had seen before, a gaunt specter with hollow eyes reflecting unspeakable sorrow, and just as quickly, that instinct I felt earlier screamed at me to run, but curiosity grounded me. My grandfather's voice echoed in an unforgiving whisper as the stranger stepped closer, gesturing towards the wall behind him, where I noticed a photograph pinned, a young man in a hotel room, ice bucket beside the bed, just like Grandpa's smile, but beneath the photograph, a hastily scrawled warning in fading ink, "Never let the ice melt." Suddenly, understanding washed over me like a wave. My grandfather filled the ice bucket to prevent whatever lingered in the shadows from coming out to claim you. The ice was a barrier, a talisman, a simple act of protection against the malevolent specters entwined in the memories of that motel. Now it all made sense. Just then the strangling silence erupted into a cacophony of laughter, the sound reverberating off the walls, and the stranger's voice broke through the dissonance, whispering, "How long can you keep the ice frozen?" My heart plummeted as I darted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, the shadows reaching out as I sprinted, practically throwing myself back into the safety of my own room, locking the door and feeling a strange calm in the chaotic breaths escaping me, and my heart suddenly steadied as I looked at the ice bucket filled high with shimmering cubes, and for a brief moment, I was reassured, but then I heard it. Soft knocks resonated against the walls, rhythmically syncing with the laughter that faded in and out of focus, as paranoia sunk in, gripping my throat tight, urging me to consider the truth, that in this place, my grandfather's careful habit may have been the only strand of safety tethering me to reality, that for every careful filling of ice was an invisible barrier against horrors just beyond the thin layer of weathered drywall and time, compelling me to realize that the room was alive, saturated with souls trapped within, and as the gentle knocks turned louder, pounding with a ferocity that threatened to collapse the flimsy space around me, I leaned into the ice bucket, surrendering to the realization that perhaps filling it was not just a strange habit, but a desperate cry to keep the past at bay, and so I vowed silently, as the darkness enveloped me, to never let the ice melt, understanding too late that in the end, it was never just about the ice, it was about survival, a survival dictated by a legacy far deeper than I had ever comprehended, and I wished with every trembling fiber of my being that I could hear my grandfather's voice one last time, reminding me that the true horror of the motels lay not just in their decaying walls but in the persistent reminder of the ice, forever filled, never melting, and the souls bound to its chilling embrace. When my friend Mark invited me to his house for a sleepover, the excitement bubbled within me, oblivious to the whispers of dread that danced at the fringes of my mind. We had spent countless afternoons together playing video games, watching horror movies, and devising increasingly ridiculous pranks, but this time felt different, charged with an unexplainable energy as we settled on the living room floor, surrounded by an arsenal of snacks and a flickering TV, the only source of light in the dimly lit room, where shadows stretched and twisted like the sinewy fingers of unseen creatures lurking in the corners. Mark's parents were strict about bedtime, and as the clock ticked steadily toward midnight, he glanced at me, his eyes lighting up with mischievous glee as he reminded me that we weren't allowed to wake up before his parents, a condition that sent a thrill down my spine, not because I feared his parents, who often kept to themselves, but because I sensed something darker lurking beneath their carefully curated home life. Sleep in Mark's house was a luxury reserved for the early mornings, hours after the sun had spilled over the horizon, bright and oblivious. Thus, we agreed to stay awake as long as possible, weaving through ghost stories and urban legends, the tales growing progressively wilder as our imaginations slipped into overdrive. When I mentioned the urban legend of the Midnight Watcher, a ghost said to enter the homes of those who slept too soundly, harvesting their dreams until they woke in a haze, yearning for something lost, Mark giggled, dismissing it as a child's tale, yet the air seemed to thicken with a palpable tension, shadows deepening around us, and it wasn't long before the world outside grew quiet, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, wrapped in a shroud of sleep. As the clock rolled deeper into the night, we engaged in deeper conversations, our words babbling like flickering sparks in the darkness, until somewhere along the line, the sound of footsteps reached us from the hallway, unsettling the hairs on the back of my neck. Dismissing it as his parents, Mark darted off to the bathroom with a shrug, while I sat alone, heart pounding in every creak of the house, an echo of an unseen threat. Yet I reminded myself it was all in good fun and decided to challenge my anxiety with one last scary story, this time about a boy who fell asleep during a sleepover and awoke to find that the game had turned deadly, an instant chill rushing through me as I spun the tale, half wondering if my own words would lure the very thing I spoke of from its hidden place, staring at the darkened corners where the flicker of the TV couldn't reach. Just as I finished, Mark returned, and I felt an odd sense of relief wash over me. Our laughter echoed through the house, but it faded too quickly, replaced by a silence that felt too thick, too heavy, until we both acknowledged it, unease crawling along our spines, and before I could say anything, the lights flickered overhead, plunging us into darkness, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen a distant memory drowned out by the beating of my pulse. We grinned at each other, feigning bravery, but the atmosphere shifted palpably. Before long, a soft tapping began, the source indiscernible, matching the frantic rhythm of my heart as it seemed to creep closer, doors creaking, furniture shifting, a distant whisper threading through the air, like someone was attempting to fold into the reality we occupied. And just as Mark was about to speak, we both froze, the light flickering back on to reveal a hulking shadow at the edge of the hallway, a figure that stood eerily still, clad in dark clothing, making it impossible to discern any features but for the glimmer of a malevolent grin. Mark was the first to react, pushing me back against the couch, and as the figure stepped toward us, I could see its wide eyes glinting, impossibly large and devoid of color, absorbing the dim light in the room until it opened its mouth, and the sound that echoed from it was an otherworldly combination of laughter and a cry, something that ignited primal fear. Just then, a crash came from the kitchen, snapping Mark and I out of our stunned freeze, and without thinking we bolted from the living room into the safety of the house. But to our horror, every door was locked tight, each knob refusing to turn or yield, trapping us in a waking nightmare. I screamed for Mark to find his parents, but the house seemed to stretch around us, twisting into an impossible labyrinth, the walls rippling with shadows that felt alive as if they thirsted for our fear. But suddenly another crash, a shattering sound that seemed to rip through the fabric of the moment, and I spotted a sliver of light seeping from under a door at the end of a long corridor, instinctively urging us toward it. Amidst the haze of terror, we sprinted down the hallway, desperation lending wings to our feet, but with every step we took, the light danced farther away, as though playing a cruel game, and I could hear Mark's breathing turn frantic beside me, as he finally began to scream for his parents, echoing in the empty house like a haunting song, a sound that melted into the whispers of the dark until I dared to peek back over my shoulder. The figure had followed us, its form now fully present, gliding toward us with an unnatural grace. I felt a strange sensation, like a whisper in my ear telling me to keep running, that the only way out was to keep moving. But in a flicker of a moment, I turned to Mark, asking if he remembered the stories of the Midnight Watcher, and the understanding flooded his face as we both realized the truth. We had triggered something ancient, something that fed on our very essence and our fear. Just when we thought we were cornered, a loud crashing sounded from below, like the whole house was shifting, and it was then I understood what had kept us in the dark. It wasn't just a precaution but a binding. We were no longer guests, but captives, or perhaps, sacrifices meant to appease the lurking darkness, and without thinking, I grasped Mark's wrist tightly, leading him to a nearby window, breaking through the taut web of despair that encased us, together tumbling into the embrace of the night, where we finally gasped for air under the blanket of stars. Our feet hit the ground as we bolted away into the cold joy of freedom, not daring to look back until the silhouette of Mark's house faded into the background, and even then, an unsettling feeling nestled in my soul, echoing with the last words spoken from that house, promising, "You weren't supposed to wake up before your parents." For weeks, I'd been hearing the same unsettling routine come from the speakers of my local radio station, KSWP, during the late-night hours when the world outside felt particularly bleak and eerie. It began innocuously enough, a scratchy voice, a grating blend of cheerful and ominous, would start off with a jovial tone, "Good evening, listeners, it's time for the name announcement." I thought it was some strange local promotion, maybe a quirky way to engage with the community. At first, it was just a curious interruption in the usual mix of soft rock and DJ chatter, but soon my ears would perk up each time I heard the broadcast, kind of like someone flipping the switch on my anxiety. It wasn't long before I heard my neighbor's name announced, followed by a cheerful congratulations, which echoed through the airwaves. It sent a jolt through my system. I never knew my neighbor was even involved with the station. What did she win? A gift card? A free meal? The next night, as the announcement rolled around again, I stopped what I was doing and leaned closer to the radio, and there it was, another familiar name, Mr. Tompkins, the kind elderly gentleman who lived a few blocks down. My skin prickled as I caught the unnerving twinkle in the announcer's voice. "You've been chosen." A shiver cascaded down my spine as each name felt more surreal, too intimate, and the fervor of the excitement in the announcer's tone only deepened my discomfort. The reason behind the announcements was shrouded in a thick fog of mystery, and I found myself fixated, the broadcast becoming an insomniac ritual that left me leaning against my bedroom wall, eyes wide open, listening for the next name. For a week, the names continued, each followed by hollow applause and laughter that didn't match the growing dread I felt creeping through my veins. It was as if someone was drumming up a sense of community, but I felt further away than ever. Thankfully, I wasn't alone. I'd brought it up with Mike, my closest friend, who had a knack for playing the skeptic. "It's just a gimmick, dude," he chuckled as we tossed a football around in my backyard. But deep down, I felt something shifting, like a storm right before it broke, and with each night, the names shifted closer to my own world. It wasn't long before my pulse raced at the uncanny recognition of my boss's name filling the airwaves. "Congratulations, Steve." I remembered how he'd left work early that day, mumbling something about family. The next broadcast brought an unexpected chill. What began as harmless intrigue transformed into an obsession that clawed at my mind. Desperate for clarity, I combed through all past broadcasts online, poking holes in a jigsaw puzzle that refused to fit. And what I pieced together shook me to my core. The names began to take on a grim pattern. It turned out, each person announced had gone missing within days of their names being read. By the third week, panic gripped me. The numbers rose, along with the disquieting awareness these innocent people, celebrated only an hour ago, were slipping into the depths of nothingness. Suddenly, my curiosity became a noose, tightening. The last broadcast of the month hung heavy in the air as I grabbed my phone. My fingers shaking as I scrolled, my heart pounding. My own name echoed through the speakers, as though it was announcing an impending doom. "Tonight's a special night for our friend, Ian. Enjoy your company." I nearly dropped my phone, dread creeping in like a thief in the dark. I had to find out who this imposter was. Reaching in the now fraying strands of paranoia, I couldn't stop the voice inside me that screamed for answers. I drove to the radio station that night with my heart in my throat. The moon casting ghostly shadows over the empty streets, the studio glowing ominously in the distance. The building's exterior had an aura of abandonment, overgrown weeds battling brick and mortar. The door creaked open like it had been untouched for years. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The desk where the announcer sat was draped in dust, and the equipment dimly blinked like a dying star. I stepped deeper, each footstep echoing in the silence, as I passed walls lined with pictures of the announcers who had long since vanished from memory. It was as if the station itself was a mausoleum, with each frame preserving a moment in time, a memory etched into the very walls. My stomach twisted, and in that darkened corridor, I spotted an open door, the faintest sound of static pulling me in like a moth to a flame. Inside sat a man hunched over a microphone, his back turned to me, fingers dancing over the controls as the telltale whine of the frequency grew louder. And in that moment, everything came crashing down. When he turned around, I froze. He had eyes that flickered like dying embers, a grotesque grin plastered across his face that sent rivulets of ice coursing through my veins. "You made it just in time," he exclaimed as the intercom crackled with the familiar refrain, "Welcome back, Ian. You're right on schedule." It was then I understood, it was never just a radio contest. The station didn't celebrate life, it harvested people. The excitement in his voice was masking something darker, an insatiable hunger for souls lost to the night, and with every name called, he lured another into his web, a new voice to fill the vacant spaces of this twisted reality. Desperate to escape, I darted back through the door, but the hallway morphed into an endless void of whispers and shadows, the radio echoing the names of those who'd come before me, and just as I realized the trap I was caught in, the announcer's voice floated down the corridor, "Let's add a new friend to our audience." With the realization hitting me that this station was my end, I heard one final name echoing into the abyss, my own, fading into obscurity, leaving me trapped in a twisted loop of horror as I became just another lost voice in the static. destined to haunt whoever tuned in next. I used to cook for a Hollywood celebrity who made me face away from him whilst he ate, and the strange dynamics of those meals still haunt me. It all started when I landed a job as a personal chef for Adrian Hale, a once A-list star whose glory days faded into B-movie obscurity, but who clung stubbornly to the remnants of his fame like a barnacle to a ship, but his fans and the world beyond had forgotten him. It was a modest role, but I was thrilled to step into his lavish home, an eccentric mansion sprawling on the outskirts of LA that looked like something out of a horror film, blackened wood beams, looming shadows, and far too many velvet drapes holding secrets in their folds. My heart pounded each time I approached that mahogany dining table, far too large for one man and always set for two, even when I mistakenly thought it was merely for show. On my first day, Adrian instructed me in a low, raspy voice to never turn to face him while he dined. "I can't stand being watched while I eat," he said, an unsettling smile creeping across his face, revealing yellowed teeth that didn't match the charm the magazines had glorified. It was odd, but I nodded, intrigued as I slaved over boiled lobster and herb-infused risotto while he lounged in the shadows, hidden from view. He would settle uncomfortably into the gilded chair, spectacles perched atop the bridge of his nose, his gaze fixed absently at some point in the room. I could hear him chewing quietly, the sound echoing eerily against the high ceilings, set against the muffled ambience of my own chopping, sizzling, and scraping. It was as if I had become nothing more than a silent observer, a specter in his life, an operator of the culinary arts. On those long, strange evenings, sometimes I caught the silhouette of his figure, a gaunt shape nestled in the depths of his chair, and felt the oppressive weight of an unseen presence in my back, as if the walls themselves were listening. I wanted to turn and look, a primal instinct tugged at me, but I remembered his warning, unnerving as it had been. The silence would stretch between us, thick with an unspeakable tension, and I couldn't shake that he was hiding something dark, something that lurked behind those murmurs and his faded charms. Gradually, I started to find notes hidden beneath the napkin rings, little snippets of poetry and jagged script, like whispers of madness draped in melodrama. They were grotesque love letters to some woman I faintly recognized from his past, Margaret, the former starlet known for her talent as much as her scandalous relationships. Appreciative glances turned sharp and resentful as if he were desperate to reach her through those fractured words. With every meal, the poems grew uglier, tinged with dark imaginings, infested with grotesque thoughts of passion and possession. My uneasy fascination morphed into something akin to dread when I began to hear noises. At dusk, low, keening cries would seep through the walls, and I'd find myself glancing over my shoulder, my heart drumming painfully in my chest. One fateful evening, as I plated a particularly elaborate dish of seared duck, the quiet horror of it all reached its peak. The air turned stale, charged with something electric and stifling as the lights flickered overhead. I sensed Adrian's eyes were on me, interception palpable despite my view-shunning posture. Then, in an unsettling twist, I thought I heard his voice. It trembled like the leaves of an autumn tree, frayed with emotion, dripping with desperation as he called my name. Something sinister demanded I look over my shoulder, that I disregard the warning I had followed religiously. I swiveled just slightly, not enough to fully betray his request, but enough to catch a glimpse of him at an unfamiliar angle, only to discover that his face appeared gaunt and unrecognizable, as if anxiety itself had consumed him whole. The sight of his fingers clawing at the flesh of the duck as though wrestling with some invisible enemy sent a chill racing down my spine, and my instincts yelled to escape. In that moment, I understood that those muffled cries seeped through the walls from his subconscious, shadows of his inner turmoil, regrets of a life poorly lived. I barely had a moment to catch my breath when he leaned forward, his teeth bared in a stretching grin that curled unnaturally along his lips, and he breathed the most horrific question into the hollowness of the room. "Tell me, do you think she's watching?" The air between us froze, thick with dread, as the words twisted around me, lingering like poison. In a moment that felt suspended in time, I leaned toward the sinuous darkness behind me, my breath hitching and heart pounding, leaving me ensnared by fear of the unknown, my body urged to run yet unable to flee. The urge flipped to compliance, and I betrayed my own promise, twisting my torso enough to fully face him, my stomach knotting at the sight of his madness. Something primal awakened inside him at that moment, and I felt that horrific revelation wash over me, that what I had stumbled onto was not merely the eccentricities of fame lost, but the manifestation of a soul untethered, a lingering spirit trapped between the past and the desolation of reality, clawing for validation through my unsuspecting hands. I no longer saw a star but a predator, hiding behind the burnt golden lights and affable charm. Before I could process the terror in those eyes, his scream erupted from his throat, harsh and as twisted as the words of his poems, echoing throughout that monstrous mansion as I turned and fled, each footfall pounding against the darkened floorboards. I reached the door. I could barely breathe as I raced outside, stumbling into the suffocating night. The chill of the air cut through me like a knife, a reminder that the reality I knew was hanging by a thread woven into his madness. Looking back at that house, I could have sworn I saw a shadow flickering. Behind the dining room's curtains, a grotesque smile lingering there in the aftermath of my defiance. I vowed never to return, but at night, the memories claw at my mind with relentless persistence, the whispers of Margaret, the darkness he hid behind while he feasted, and that terrible question, was she ever truly gone, or was she navigating the twisted corridors of his soul, watching as I cooked and placed plates before a man who was still very much haunted by his past. I still hear Adrian's laughter when sleep dares come. Memories of that round dining table ground me in the reality of his madness, and as much as I try to drown it out, I know one thing: in Hollywood, no one truly escapes unscathed, and some shadows are far worse than others. I remember the day the emergency alert blared through our phones, a shrill siren that jolted everyone out of their daily routines. "Emergency alert, do not look at the sky," it said, the text flashing ominously on our screens, and for a moment, the world stood still as confusion radiated through the crowd at the park, the children at play pausing mid-laughter, parents exchanging worried glances, the air thick with a mix of anticipation and dread. At first, I scoffed at the absurdity of it all. How could the sky, a vast canvas of blue and white, ever pose a threat? But then the low rumble began, the sound of something large and heavy moving above us, and dread slithered down my spine like a cold serpent. I looked at my friends, their faces reflecting the shared uncertainty and unspoken fear that enveloped us like a shroud. We instinctively huddled together, drawn by an invisible force of protection, all of us too aware that the world we once knew was on the brink of unraveling. As the rumbling intensified, so did the unease. I glanced around. Some people had already started to scream, their eyes wide in horror as though they could see something we couldn't, and that only heightened my dread. "I'm going to look, Justin," my adventurous friend declared, breaking the collective hush. "You guys are being ridiculous." There was something reckless in his voice, a thrill-seeker's bravado that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I grabbed his arm, pleading, "Please, don't," but it was too late. He had already turned, and in one fluid motion, his gaze lifted toward the heavens. The moment his eyes met the vastness above, a silence fell, even more profound than before. I could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the earth beneath us. And then, I saw it, an enormous shadow, something that should not exist at all, blotting out the sun, a writhing mass that defied description. The texture was wrong, like dark, sickly smoke twisting against the blue, dripping into the atmosphere, and there was a glint, a flicker of something metallic among the shadows, but it was the movement, a slow, deliberate pulse that drew us in with an almost magnetic lure. Justin's scream shattered the silence, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the park, and just like that, everything spiraled into chaos. People were stumbling away from the park benches and picnic blankets, pets barking and running, children crying, and I felt the tight grip of panic clawing at my throat. We were supposed to look away, to obey the alert, but something primal deep within compelled us to gaze up at the terror that loomed over us, the terrible beauty of it making me feel both small and significant in a way I couldn't understand. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart racing, but the images still pressed against my mind, as if the horror could seep in through my eyelids, and I fought the urge to peer upwards once more. It felt like an eternity, though it was only moments before a low hum grew louder, a sound teetering on the brink of something otherworldly. The air felt heavy, dense with anticipation. We were caught in the eye of some cosmic storm, force fields shifting that we couldn't comprehend. Then, amidst the chaos, I felt it, a presence, something coalescing within the fabric of reality that encircled us like woven threads of fate, and a whisper caressed my ear like the breath of a ghost. "Look," it said, and dread washed over me like an icy wave. "You can't resist, you must know." With sheer force of will, I wrenched my eyes open and grabbed for Justin, who was still staring upward, his face frozen in a rapture that terrified me beyond any horror movie I had ever seen. "We need to go," I shouted, but he didn't react. He was transfixed, entranced by whatever lay above. Panic surged through me, And before I realized what I was doing, I found my own gaze turning back towards that terrible shadow, the spinning mass slowly revealing vague shapes against the dark, faces twisted in expressions of sorrow, horror, and longing, all sculpted against a backdrop of dread that sent shivers down my spine. I felt as if we were being pulled into a greater consciousness, a harvest of screams and whispers, welcoming us to witness the end. It was then that I realized those who were truly staring at the sky were changing, their eyes darkened, reflections swallowed by shadow, their limbs slack, as if all fight had left them. I lunged toward Justin, wrapping my arms around his waist, trying to pull him down, but it felt as if I was fighting a river with an undertow that was beyond my strength. "You have to leave." I struggled to shout, but panic strangled my voice, leaving only a hoarse whisper. Then, I looked to the others. They were becoming something I could barely recognize, eyes glossed and mouths slack, as if they were falling into a deep trance, joining whatever was beckoning them. As I strained against him, desperately attempting to drown out the voice that teased my own sanity, I felt an almost overwhelming urge to let go, to succumb to whatever creature hung above us, seductive and terrible, to allow it to fill me with knowledge beyond our small existence. When the sound of sirens broke through the haze, these were real police, real authorities coming to save us, and instinctively, the crowd began to scatter. I pulled with all my might, wrenching Justin from the pull of the sky, and in that fervent rush of adrenaline, we turned and ran, sprinting toward the distant flashing lights, the cries of the people following us like an eerie echo, the sirens merging into a cacophony of chaos. As we fled deeper into alleyways and side streets, I couldn't shake the vision from my mind, churning and twisting like a nightmare I couldn't shake, and I knew we were far from safe. I caught my breath, staring back at the park now veiled in clouds of dark smoke as people still stood, transfixed by the ceiling of despair that continued to loom over them like a harbinger of doom. But as we sprinted out of sight, I couldn't help but feel that whatever that thing was, whatever pulled Justin and the others into its embrace, would not stop until it had consumed every soul gazing upwards. The emergency alert never stopped ringing in my head, an echo that would never quite fade, a warning that twisted my sanity as I thought of the friends we left behind, each one now possibly a vessel for something far more sinister. Days passed, and though sirens echoed night after night, I found it impossible to sleep. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, whispers danced in the wind, and silent screams echoed through my mind, taunting me with the knowledge that some things shouldn't be seen. Yet, despite the haunting, gnawing need to look, I held on to my last shreds of sanity, clinging to the hope that perhaps, in the darkest corners of this horror, there still lurked a chance that I wouldn't become one of them, trapped in that endless cycle of despair. But every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispered invitation luring me to look, to embrace that which humanity was never meant to know, reminding me that as long as there are skies above, there are horrors hidden among the clouds, waiting patiently for someone to dare look up again. I found my little sister's diary when I was cleaning out the attic, a dusty, forgotten space filled with old toys and memories of a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. The diary was buried under stacks of yellowed magazines and broken picture frames, its faded cover a soft pink with a glittery heart that seemed to wink at me in the dim light. I hesitated, memories flooding back of the times I had ignored her, too wrapped up in my own world, my friends, and my teenage dramas to see the signs that she was struggling. She had always been the quiet one, content to draw in her room or curl up with a book while I chased fleeting popularity. As I flipped through the diary's pages, my heart dropped at the neat, childlike script that danced before my eyes. Most entries spoke of dreams and innocence, of crushes on boys at school, but soon, the tone shifted. One entry mentioned a strange girl in our neighborhood who wore a tattered dress, always standing just out of sight, a shadow in the corner of the eye. I could almost hear my sister's voice, her words tinged with intrigue and fear, as she detailed how the girl whispered secrets to her when the night crept in, urging her to come outside and play in the dark. I thought it was just child's imagination, a coping mechanism for loneliness, a story to weave around her fears, but as I continued to read, I felt an icy grip around my heart when I realized the illustrations had changed too. The once simple figures morphed into grotesque shapes with wide, hungry mouths and eyes that seemed to pierce right through the page. In one entry, she mentioned the girl coaxing her to follow her into the woods, claiming to have found a magical place just beyond the trees, a refuge where her worries would melt away. I had always thought our woods were enchanted in a light-hearted way, with their sprawling oaks and hidden streams, but now I was filled with dread as I recalled seeing her wander off toward that direction just days before, a carefree smile on her face. What startled me the most was the last entry, dated just a few days before I unearthed this nightmare. It sent chills cascading over me. It said she had gone with the girl, that they were to meet at the old swing set, the one that had fallen into rust and disrepair, where she would finally make her wish come true. Swallowing hard, I couldn't help but remember the police search, the dread that had settled over our family all those months ago when she had gone missing, the way the neighborhood came together only to offer hollow words of comfort and sympathy while they secretly whispered about how I could have let her disappear, and as waves of guilt washed over me, I flipped the page frantically, desperate for answers. The next one had jagged lines scrawled across it, a frantic plea that read, "It's getting harder to remember. I want to go home. The girl won't let me leave." My heart raced with a terror I couldn't understand, pounding against my ribs. Like a warning bell as the realization hit me full force, the strange girl had taken her somewhere dark and terrible where I couldn't reach her. I felt like I was suffocating as I gripped the edges of the diary, wishing to turn back time to save her from whatever fate had unraveled before her. I rushed downstairs, the diary still clutched in my hands, my mind racing with questions screaming to be answered. Rushing to my mom, I told her I had found something that could help us find my sister. Together, we searched for the old swing set, an almost mythical place we had long abandoned. It was drenched in shadow, the sun blocked out by overhanging branches that whispered secrets in a language I did not understand. As we approached, the rusted chains creaked eerily, and for a second, I thought I saw her swing, her favorite, moving slightly, as if beckoning me to sit. My mom's voice trembled as she called my sister's name, her words dissolving in the heavy silence that clung to us like a shroud. Then, we heard something soft and childlike, a giggle echoing through the trees, sending chills rippling down my spine. I turned to my mom, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with realization, and just then I knew that the girl was still there, waiting, and I could feel the diary's words still swirling in my mind like a haunting refrain. We called out again, desperation clawing at our throats as we pushed forth into the eerie quiet, but there was no answer, only the rustling leaves and the sinister echo of that distant laughter, mocking us as we hunted for something that felt so impossibly lost. I wished I had never opened her diary, wished I had buried it deeper where the shadows wouldn't reach us, but deep inside, the hunger for closure and the excruciating burden of guilt twisted my gut, anchoring me to the spot. I wanted to scream, to cry out for her, but the dark woods around us swallowed our voices whole, reminding me that we had ventured into a realm that no longer belonged to us, and as dusk began to settle around us, wrapping the world in an ominous embrace, I understood I might have found her diary, but I would never find her again. My grandmother tried to drown me as a baby, and I now understand why. It starts with a hazy memory, one that feels more like a vague imprint on my mind from early childhood, but one that was often replayed to me through family whispers and sidelong glances. I was told my grandmother was a stern, old-world woman, steeped in traditions that spanned generations, and there was a chilling sense of inevitability about that damp afternoon in the garden when she took me to the pond. The sun hung low, casting an ethereal glow around her as she stood, a figure who seemed both terrifying and captivating at once. My mother had gone inside for just a moment, and in that fragment of time, the world seemed to shift. She whispered something in an ancient language that sent shivers down my spine, and then she plunged my swaddled form into the cold depths, her hands surprisingly strong. I was too young to understand panic, but I was aware of the splashes and sounds muffled by water as I fought against the embrace of the darkness. It felt like eternity until she pulled me out, shaking her head as though disappointed. I learned later this wasn't an act of malevolence, it was an initiation, or so I was told, an ancient rite of passage veiled in unfortunate circumstance. Growing up, my life was marked with strange occurrences, shadowy figures lurking at the edge of my vision, whispers that seemed to rise from the walls, and the feeling of being watched, even in the privacy of my room. The stories intensified in high school when I began to isolate myself, the weight of knowing that part of me was tied to the inexplicable ritual. I often heard my relatives converse in hushed tones, their eyes darting like moths around a flame whenever I entered the room, as if I were a key to a mystery they feared to unlock. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the family journal, a leather-bound tome that smelled of dust and old secrets, in the attic that everything started coming together. Scrawled among the pages were notes about a generational curse initiated by my great-grandmother, an ancestral connection to a water spirit that demanded sacrifice, and how every female descendant had approached maturity with a price to pay. The requirement seemed grim but oddly serene. The spirit needed to see a demonstration of fearlessness to protect our family from misfortune, and my grandmother believed that the cold water would awaken some ancient power within me as intended. I became obsessed, powerless to shrug off the weight of this family legacy. Weeks turned into months as I wrestled with sleepless nights filled with vivid dreams of swirling waters and ghostly hands reaching for me. I'm certain it's why I always felt drawn to the sea and the storms that echoed in my mind like a battle cry, an insatiable urge to test this dark inheritance. With every wave crashing against the shore, I would stand at the water's edge, staring out into the abyss, longing to immerse myself fully, halfway believing that if I could submerge deep enough, I might finally unlock the truth about who I was meant to be. By the time I hit my 20s, I'd become a modern-day water witch, hosting small reckless ceremonies by the shore, lighting candles while chanting forgotten verses into the night as I tried to reclaim my power from the depths of my lineage. In a moment of reckless abandon, I decided to plunge into the ocean, fully aware of the stakes I was playing with. As the cold wrapped around me, I felt time dissolve, my every instinct lit with primal energy, the shadows below beckoning. For that split second before diving down, I glimpsed a figure, half-formed and luminous, watching me from beneath the waves, and my heart pounded with sheer terror and awed familiarity. It was both beautiful and horrifying, and as I propelled deeper into the water, I caught a glimpse of the reflection in its eyes, my grandmother's face staring back, a twisted version of the woman I had come to fear, and the realization crashed down like a tidal wave. She had seen something within me that I couldn't fully comprehend yet, something sacred yet cursed. The moment my lungs burned and I clawed my way to the surface, gasping for air, I understood that she hadn't wanted to drown me as much as she had aimed to protect me from whatever darkness lay in waiting, perhaps thinking that through drowning me, she could save me, or awaken whatever spirit had been looming over our family for generations. And in that harrowing clarity, I realized my life would never have the peace I'd craved. I can almost hear the whispers now, the outlines of family voices echoing far off, now too entangled with the restless spirit of the water that lingers in my veins, beckoning me back down, not just to confront my fears but to join a lineage I cannot escape. So here I stand at the precipice, searching for what remains of my grandmother in the swirling depths as the waves crash ferociously against the rocks, and I wonder if I'll finally sink deep enough to understand why she truly tried to drown me, or if it's too late to resist the pull of the water that seems to call my name. I woke up in a place I didn't recognize, the familiar sound of birds chirping seeming simultaneously comforting and eerie. I rubbed my eyes, forcing myself to remember how I got there, but all I could recall was a mundane evening spent in my cramped apartment, binge-watching an old sci-fi series. The scent of freshly cut grass wafted in through the open window, and as I slid out of bed, I felt an unsettling sense of time slipping through my fingers. I stepped onto the carpet, which felt soft and somehow inviting, yet I felt a chill as I gazed out the window to observe the street outside. Perfectly manicured lawns lined the road, colorful flowers blooming in intricate arrangements, and neat little houses with white picket fences that seemed to glow in the early morning sun. Each house looked identical, cookie-cutter dwellings that might have been plucked from a glossy magazine, and I noticed a peculiar absence of life, no cars passing, no people walking their dogs. Only silence hung heavily in the air. I slowly walked out of my room, navigating the maze of hallways until I found the front door oddly ajar. Curiosity gnawed at me, and despite a gnawing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach, I stepped out to explore. The moment my feet hit the pavement, a wave of surreal calm washed over me, as if the outside world was designed solely for my comfort. I wandered through the streets, calling out hello. Without an answer, and every time I turned a corner, the streets looked the same. Houses repeating in infinite symmetry. With each step, I felt the ground beneath me pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, but the eeriness sunk its tendrils deeper into my mind. Days became a blur as I roamed these suburban labyrinths, sometimes finding strange objects, an old camera busting with dust or a rusted bicycle that had clearly seen better days, left on sidewalks, but never a soul in sight. I tried walking back to where I thought I had begun, but I soon realized the streets rearranged themselves, paths curving in ways that made no sense. I tried counting my steps, marking each corner with my thoughts, but something about the repetition echoed a dreadful familiarity. The houses watched, I swore, their windows like eyes peering at me as I frantically searched for a way out, a glimpse of a friendly face, or simply a sound of life beyond this painted prison. The first week slipped away in a haze of confusion and despair. I labored to remember my life before this place, desperately reconstructing memories of friends, family, and warmth, but all I found were shadows that eluded my grasp. As the sun dipped below the horizon one night, painting the sky a watercolor of oranges and purples, I noticed lights flickering in a house just a street over. Hope ignited in my chest like wildfire as I sprinted towards it, convinced I would finally find another person or something that knew I existed. But when I knocked at the door, it simply opened with a slow creak, revealing an empty interior blanketed in darkness. I stepped inside, heart racing, calling out, but only the echoes of my own voice returned in mocking whispers. Suddenly, I spotted something, a journal sitting drearily on a table lit by the dying sun, the pages worn and yellowed. Each entry was a confession, a series of frantic scrawls by someone claiming to have experienced what I was going through, detailing their own futile attempts to escape the suburb that sealed them in. You see the same faces, the same trees, the same sky over and over. Your reflection will dance in every window, mocking you until the day you join them. The last entry was hurried and smeared, writing almost spilling onto the floor as if they had some realization just before their descent into madness. You aren't alone. But you'll pray for it. I slammed the journal shut, panic clawing up my throat, and bolted back outside, clutching the journal tightly, my heart pounding like a prisoner in a cell desperate for freedom. Each sunset bled into the next, the repetition wrapping tighter around me, filling every sound with whispers as I felt eyes on my back. I encountered brief flickers of movement, shadows starting behind curtains, an outline emerging and vanishing between houses, but every time I looked, nothing remained. I decided to test the limits of this nightmare, shouting into the void, screaming for whoever or whatever might hear me, begging for someone to respond, yet the only answer came from the echo of my own desperation. Days turned into what felt like years. I lost track of how many sunrises and sunsets had painted the sky, a cycle of agony with no end. I returned to the journal, each word resonating deeper within my soul until I became entwined with the fear that crawled off the pages. A final entry caught my eye. Find the mirror that reflects yourself, touch it, and you may find clarity, or be trapped within forever. I felt a surge of urgency lacing each heartbeat as I sprinted back to the street I first wandered out of, searching for even a glimmer of hope, praying the guidance from the journal would lead me. I stopped in front of one particularly drab house, the paint peeling and the shutters barely hanging on, and there it stood, a massive mirror, towering and ornate, in the front yard, with the surface reflecting my frantic movements. I hesitated, contemplating the warning. The words of the previous occupant echoed, drawing me closer. As I touched the glass, an electric shock coursed through me, an overwhelming sensation of being pulled by unseen hands, and the reflection warped and twisted into nightmarish forms. 1,000 faces flitted across the surface, they weren't my own but echoed a haunting familiarity. I stumbled back, breathless, heart racing, and that was when I noticed it. The faces weren't just reflections, they were inhabitants of this cursed suburb, all those that had crawled within before me now trapped in this otherworldly prison, pleading for release. With haunted eyes, I turned to run, but the world around me shook, the houses swaying like reeds in the wind, their walls closing in. I darted down streets like a madman, every turn bringing me back to where I began, the same manicured lawns, the same perfect houses, nothing changed. I was ensnared in a never-ending cycle. Frantic, I fell to my knees, anguished shouts spilling forth as I felt the crushing weight of my realization. I could scream forever into the void of this infinite suburb, yet I remained utterly alone, a ghost among the shadows, trapped in a landscape of endless familiar facades, yearning and waiting, praying that someone might answer, knowing in my heart that soon, I might join those tortured reflections, another face behind the glass, forever reflecting the emptiness of this place. I've been a 911 operator for over 5 years now, and let me tell you, you think you've heard it all, but sometimes I wish I could unhear the things that come through the line, like that call from the woman who said she could see me through the kitchen window. At first, I thought she was just panicking. After all, it was the middle of a stormy night and she kept saying something about the man in the shadows, but when I asked her about her location, she replied, "You know where I am, can't you see me?" As if my voice had somehow betrayed my place in the world. And that's when I felt the hairs on my neck stand straight up. There was no one else in the call center with me, at least not anyone I could hear, and I started hearing these strange muffled sounds behind her voice, almost like whispers, like the people behind her were giving her directions, and wrapped tightly around my gut was an unease I couldn't shake. I rushed to dispatch a patrol, while she started talking about how the shadows were alive, how they danced along the walls, but they were waiting, and then she stopped mid-sentence, as if she had truly looked outside and could see the shade of my own figure standing there, and I thought for just a second, absurdly, maybe I was somehow the one in danger. The call cut off before I could center myself and refocus, but when the squad arrived at the location, they found nothing but an open door that creaked eerily in the wind, and the entire house was abandoned. Everyone thought the previous owners had skipped town in a hurry, leaving everything behind like a ghost town. Another time, I answered a call from a child, about 8 years old, who claimed he was hiding from something in his closet. His voice shivered through the receiver as he said the thing had long hands and it was watching him. In the background, you could hear his parents arguing, a familiar chaos from my own childhood, and I tried to keep my tone steady as I reassured him that first I needed to know his address. All he could do was whimper as he repeated that he had to be quiet, because it was coming for him. I pulled all my strength into remaining calm, the urge to scream drowning in a sea of reason, when suddenly, I heard a low creaking noise on the line, like a door slowly opening, and I instinctively found myself straining to listen, praying that whatever haunted him would slip back into the shadows. The child froze, and I called out his name, urging him on. The noise grew louder, like something was shuffling through his belongings. "Run," I yelled, hoping he could hear me amongst his sobs, but the line went dead before I could get the address. Moments later, I contacted the police, but by that time, they arrived just in time to see his distraught parents blubbering over an empty room. All the furniture was disturbed, just like he had said, but no child was found in the house, not even in the closet. I was losing myself to doubts following those calls, but nothing prepared me for the one that came late one night, around 2 in the morning, when a man's voice came across the line, calm and steady, and he told me quite plainly that his mother was having an episode. Alarm bells rang in my head, but the man was a master manipulator, making it seem as though the situation was mild as he calmly talked about how he would have to restrain her, that it was just the 3 of them in this terrible situation. For every question I asked, he had an answer ready, but something in the cadence of his voice filled me with dread. It was too smooth, devoid of any real emotion, like he had rehearsed every line. I begged him to describe what was happening, frazzled as I noticed the clock's minute hand slipping toward 3, when he suddenly asked, "Do you want to hear her?" I froze, a paralysis gripping my mind as I gathered my courage and whispered for him to do so because it was protocol, and with that, a shattering scream echoed through the receiver, a noise that twisted and contorted like the very fabric of reality, and I felt it vibrate through my bones, striking deep into the core of my being. I yelled for him to hang up and give me an address, but it turned to utter chaos in an instant as he placed the phone down and I could hear furniture scraping against floors, desperate cries, and an unholy laughter followed by a suffocating silence. The call cut, the line flatlined, and when the police arrived at the home he'd given, they found a house, still and eerily quiet, but the only sign of life was the deep whirl of the ceiling fan spinning above, and the empty space where his mother should have been. My supervisor always says to keep my head, no matter how bizarre the calls, but I broke with the last one that came in, a low, raspy voice that croaked into my ear, calling me by name, and when I froze, he repeated it, and then laughed as he said he could see me clearly, that I was always so bright in his dark world. I slammed my palm against the receiver in horror, the weight of all those calls crashing down on me, and I couldn't breathe as I stumbled to find the button to alert my colleagues, to stop this insanity, but the voice continued, "You shouldn't have written my name down." It rattled through my head like the rattle of a snake, and I remembered staring wide-eyed at the desk, breath caught in my throat, until finally I found that button. The entire call center erupted into motion as I tried to explain, but they just shook their heads, as if this wasn't the first time someone had cracked under pressure. They told me to take the rest of the night off. I stumbled out into the stillness of the night, and as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in the recesses of my mind, those calls echoing, each a growing shadow, and as the last streaks of light faded behind the horizon, I felt the truth creep in with a silent dread. Some calls are strange because they're a warning, and those whispers behind the voices are just the beginning. Has anyone seen the upside-down woman? I wish I could say I'm just another voice in the crowd asking about some local legend, but it's far too personal for that. It all began last summer when my friend Sarah became obsessed with this woman who haunts the nearby forest. It started innocently enough. She'd scroll social media, laughing about some viral video of a girl claiming she'd encountered a creature that walks on its hands while staring at you with eyes too wide and far too bright, the kind of folklore that gets passed around campfires. But Sarah wanted more. She insisted we go into the woods at dusk and search for this sinister figure, claiming the thrill of encountering the absurdly impossible was too strong to resist. So, one fateful Friday, I found myself tiptoeing through those dense trees, the sun dipping below the horizon, leaving shadows to roam beneath the towering pines. As we walked deeper, the atmosphere shifted. What had once been a gentle rustle of leaves became eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sarah's excitement began to wane as twilight sprawled out its dark fingers, curls of mist curling around our ankles, and she began asking me if I thought we should turn back, yet something twisted within me dared us to press on. We stumbled upon a clearing, a small glade illuminated by fading light, and there it was, a figure perched on the edge of the trees. It looked like a woman, hair long and wild, twisted in a way that sent chills down my spine. But what made it grotesque was the way she was hanging upside down, her limbs contorted and spider-like, eyes glinting unnaturally as if they absorbed all the light around them. I froze as I felt the cold grip of panic clutch my heart, but Sarah took a step forward, whispering, "Look, there's our girl, catch her on video." My protests fell on deaf ears as Sarah raised her phone, and before I could shout for her to stop, the woman tilted her head, her mouth stretching into a ghastly smile that seemed to replicate the very shape of fear itself. The phone's flash clicked, casting a harsh light on that haunting face, and in that instant, time seemed to warp. The woman lunged at us, eyes wide and unblinking, the sound of leaves crunching beneath her twisted limbs echoed like thunder. I grabbed Sarah's arm and we bolted, branches tearing at our clothes as we stumbled through the underbrush. The only sound in my ears was my own panicked breathing mixed with Sarah's screams. We didn't stop until we reached the car, slamming the doors shut, panting wildly, convinced we had escaped some ancient predator. That night, Sarah shared the video with our group, and her face lit up with excitement as she replayed it, but the image was warped, distorted in strange ways not representative of the reality we saw. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to change. She grew distant, her laughter was replaced with whispers of anxiety, and I could see dark circles forming under her eyes, a shadow of the vibrant girl I used to know. One evening, I insisted we talk, but she barely responded, just kept staring at her phone, her fingers scrolling through an endless feed of notifications. It wasn't until I noticed it, the comments, filled with irrational fear and disbelief, but interspersed with messages that echoed the things she spoke of in the woods. "The upside-down woman is coming for you, or she wants you to look at her." I suggested we should return, thinking that confronting the horror would allow us to heal, but she just shook her head, whispering that she could feel the woman's presence lurking, waiting, almost like she had tagged her in some dark game. I should have taken this seriously, and it made my skin crawl to see her spiral deeper into this obsession. And then one night as I sat with her watching the horror unfold on social media, Sarah abruptly stood up, walked into the woods behind her house, her silhouette swallowed by darkness. I called for her to come back, but she didn't respond. I could feel the weight of a terrible dread clouding my mind. I grabbed my jacket and followed, and all I could hear was the rustle of the trees, and a sick feeling settled in my stomach. After searching for what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into that same clearing, heart racing but no sign of Sarah. Then, out of nowhere, I felt the air shift. Chills pricked my arms as I turned, and there she was, the upside-down woman, her gaze locked onto me, and my breath hitched as she took a step forward, limbs moving with unnatural dexterity, hair brushing the forest floor like vines. I wanted to scream, to run, to turn my back and escape, but it was as if she held me in place with her gaze. A slow realization dawned, that I hadn't just stumbled upon something of folklore, I'd become a part of it. Just then, a whisper filled the air, low and rasping, "She wants you to be upside down too." The world flipped, everything felt distorted, as if I was peering through a crooked lens, the trees dancing with shadows, and I suddenly felt a weight against my own limbs, unexplainable and gruesome, as if unseen hands were turning me inside out. And then the vision of Sarah crept into my mind, and I understood the truth. They didn't just want to be recognized, they wanted to assimilate, to pull you into their darkness, wrapping you up tight until you're unrecognizable, hanging just like them. I mustered every ounce of will and tore my gaze from the woman, throwing myself towards the direction of home, but the laughter echoed around me, hollow and cruel, and I could hear the whispers seep into my consciousness, echoing my name. I burst through the underbrush, eyes frantically searching for the portal back to reality, and as my feet hit the familiar dirt path, the laughter flourished into a crescendo, engulfing me in its echo. I didn't stop until I was safe inside my house. I didn't sleep as I waited for dawn, but with every tick of the clock, I could feel it, that undeniable connection whispering from the trees. Now, as I write this under the sanctity of these walls, I must warn you, you can't look for the upside-down woman, because once you see her, she won't let you go. She lingers, transforming you until the day comes when you step into the shadows, pulled by an irresistible force, and she smiles knowing she has another. Has anyone seen the upside-down woman? I dread that question, yet I find myself wondering if perhaps she is already here, watching, waiting, just out of sight, and I cannot shake the icy grip of her unsettling gaze. I still can't believe it happened, like a scene from a terrible dark comedy. It all began with one innocent sleepover at my house when my friends, Sarah, Jenna, and Mike learned that my dad had an OnlyFans account, and they couldn't stop talking about it, which would have been embarrassing enough, but the way they dug into it and became increasingly obsessed crossed a boundary I wish they'd never approached. It had started when Sarah joked about looking up random profiles for fun, and somehow, on a whim, she decided to search for my dad's name, which, in hindsight, I realized is a pretty unusual name. He had always told me to be careful about online privacy, but I guess I never really understood why until that night. I felt my stomach drop when Sarah's laugh turned into that awkward silence. It's the kind that coats the room in an unsettling chill, and when I gathered the courage to look over her shoulder at the phone, I was met with the humiliating reality. There it was, a subscription account, complete with my dad's face in a terrible lighting, half smiling in a way that looked more like a grimace. The photos were set to a backdrop of a low-budget living room, and I immediately regretted everything that had led up to this moment. The beads of sweat on my forehead sizzled under the heat of realization as they dissected every photo, every comment, turning it into a spectacle that felt utterly surreal, and all I wanted to do was sink deep into the ground, hoping it would swallow me whole. They laughed and teased, making comments I wished I could erase, and then, to my horror, I saw a shift in their demeanor, a sort of fascination rooted in something I couldn't understand, something that began with giggles but morphed into an unhealthy obsession. They scrolled through my dad's profile, their eyes wide with both shock and intrigue, and the way they talked about him transformed from casual jokes to an unsettling analysis of his posts. He's actually kinda hot, Jenna remarked with a devil-may-care wink that felt like a nail in my coffin of embarrassment. Within hours, they were pulling out their phones and de facto breaking the rules of normalcy, igniting a frenzy fueled by likes and comments that I wanted to douse with gasoline. It became routine for them to make jokes about my dad's content, leaving me feeling like some kind of unwilling participant in a circus act, and the way they gossiped fueled a fire that I feared I would never be able to extinguish. I tried to talk to them about what they were doing, tried to express that it crossed a line, but they brushed me off, engrossed in their newfound fascination as they started to generate increasingly wild theories about my dad, like they were art critics dissecting a masterpiece, and soon they weren't just interested. It was as if the allure of my dad's account held a magnetic pull they couldn't ignore. Late-night watch parties evolved, where they'd sit huddled around their phones, streaming his videos like some twisted form of entertainment, leaving me to stew in a pot of mortification, feeling strangely protective of someone who had unknowingly turned into a spectacle. I tried to ignore it, but there was a point when it became too much. They started discussing his personal life based solely on what he posted, weaving narratives that felt disturbingly plausible. They knew more about my dad than I did, and even though I wanted to secede from the chaos, the blends of jealousy and bewilderment only grew. It was one chilling night when I awoke to a barrage of messages on my phone from all three of them, panicked and electrified, claiming they discovered something dark on my dad's account, like an innocent jigsaw puzzle that morphed into a horror story. It turned out they'd found photos that weren't even part of the original account, disturbing images showing my dad with unrecognizable figures in shadowy corners of our neighborhood, masked and lurking, the kind of imagery that should never exist outside of a haunted film. The way they gripped their phones, scrolling feverishly and gasping in unison, felt both exhilarating and terrifying, as if they had stumbled upon a real-life horror mystery. And while I begged them to stop looking, to delete the app and forget about everything, they pulled me into their manic circle, spinning theories of my dad being wrapped up in something sinister, something they were convinced extended beyond the screen. As one photo led to another and our night spiraled deeper into chaos, paranoia settled in. My friends started to change, their conversations littered with whispers, their eyes darting around like deer in the headlights as they became fixated on every creak in my house, every flicker of light like it was a signal from something otherworldly. I could feel the tension suffocating us, and when Mike suggested that it might be better to confront my dad, to demand answers through their wild hypothesis, I shut him down. The thought of dragging my father into our twisted obsession felt wrong, but they wouldn't listen. That's when Sarah proposed a plan. We would sneak into my house while he was away, and quietly take a look around his office, because surely there were more secrets lurking beneath the surface. I protested, feeling like I was on the brink of a dark spiral I couldn't control, but before I knew it, I was caught in their excitement, swept up in the tide as we crept into my house once my dad left for his weekend fishing trip. Their laughter turned into sharp whispers as we rummaged through drawers and sifting through papers, our hearts racing with a blend of fear and anticipation. But what we uncovered felt even darker than I could have imagined. Old letters, strange receipts, even pictures that suggested my dad might have more connections to those shadowy figures than we ever considered possible. The way my friends' excitement morphed almost immediately into palpable dread was unsettling. They turned to me, eyes widening, faces draining of color, but their obsession clawed at their sanity, compelling them to analyze every item in the dim light of the office. As I tried to voice my discomfort, suggesting perhaps we should leave it alone, they pushed onwards, and the shift in the air grew heavy like static before a storm when suddenly, I noticed something, a locked drawer without a key, but I wasn't ready for what they would do next. Fueled by their lust for answers and oblivious to the looming dangers, they started searching for anything to pry it open, when Jenna found a knife of all things, gleefully declaring that it was all in the name of discovery. As they succeeded in slicing the woodwork, an ominous sound reverberated through the air, like ominous giggles frozen in time as they pulled the drawer open to reveal a set of photos of what I could only call nightmares, haunting images of families, my dad connected to each soul with an emotion I couldn't decipher, and I'll never forget Mike's face going ashen as he whispered that they looked eerily like missing persons from news broadcasts. Panic enveloped us, trapped in the snare of realization that my dad's online life was connected to something sinister far beyond our imagination, and just as apprehension washed over us like a tidal wave, a light flickered ominously from outside the window, stunning us into complete silence. My heart raced as I turned slowly, fear intensifying as shadows danced wildly in the moonlight. That's when the door creaked open, and I felt the blood drain from my face as my dad walked in. A wicked smile spread across his lips as if he had known all along about our twisted adventure, and the charged air surrounding my friends crackled with intrigue and terror. But before I could comprehend the danger we had stumbled into, I realized, they didn't care about the truth anymore. They only wanted to know how far they could take this absurd journey, dragging my fractured reality deeper into the abyss. And as the spectral figure flickered behind him, cloaked in shadows and secrets, I could only hope to escape the spiraling nightmare they had ignited. A darker tale than the one we'd originally sought, a story that would forever change the way I viewed the world, and demons beyond my wildest imaginings. It's funny how a seemingly innocent game can lead to the darkest places. I learned that the hard way one sleepless night last November when I stumbled upon a twisted little app called White Noise, black screen, just another mindless distraction to drown out my thoughts while I waited for my insomnia to fade, or at least until morning arrived. I downloaded it out of boredom, lured by the promise of soothing ambient sounds and a pitch-black screen that was supposed to help me sleep while masking the world's intrusion. But as soon as I hit play, I was enveloped by an unsettling static noise, like a radio tuning into something far beyond this world. So instead of calming me, it fueled my anxious curiosity. I remember curling up in bed, headphones snug over my ears, and as I delved deeper into the app, the static somehow morphed, a low hum swelling into a reluctantly familiar rhythm. The screen remained black, yet I could feel something flickering at the edges of my vision, something dark waiting and watching as I laid there frozen. Hoping to brush off the mounting discomfort, I closed my eyes and let the white noise wash over me, but then I heard whispers rising from the static, a multitude of voices weaving together like an ominous choir, their frenzied mutterings clawing at the back of my mind. "Come play with us." They beckoned, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as fear coiled tightly in my stomach. I recoiled, yanking the headphones off, but the sound clung to me like a sinister memento, echoing in my thoughts, so I hesitantly put them back on, perhaps driven by the inexplicable need to know what was happening. As I surrendered to the noise once more, a disembodied child's laughter escaped the static, bright and inviting before descending into chilling shrieks. The black screen flashed just long enough for me to see a face, a pale profile set against an inky backdrop, eyes wide and twisted into an expression of glee that sent an icy shock through my veins, and in that heart-stopping moment, I felt a prickling sensation as if something had clawed its way into my reality. I jerked upright, ripping the cord from my phone, and for a moment, silence fell over the room like a suffocating blanket. But just when I thought I'd escaped whatever nightmare lay in that app, my phone's screen flickered back to life, and those same whispers washed over me, now emanating from the device itself as the battery gauge plummeted to zero, though I hadn't plugged it in for hours. I tossed the phone aside, convinced I was losing my grip, but then came another laugh, this time louder, unmistakably in my room, echoing off the walls as it sharpened into something undeniably sinister. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stood frozen in terror, debating whether to reach for the light switch, knowing deep down that looking wouldn't change anything, yet the air was thick with a presence that dared me not to. I hesitated, caught between the need for light and the paralyzing dread of what I might see, but when the laughter spiraled into terrified sobs, panic conquered reason, and I flipped the switch. The room flooded with light, and I collapsed back against my bed, half expecting the darkness itself to recoil from the radiance, but there was nothing there, only the glaring beams reflecting off scattered objects and my phone, still ominously quiet on the floor. I tried to rationalize it, to shake off the whispers as nothing more than a figment of exhaustion or the result of my despondent mind playing tricks on me, yet sleep eluded me in waves, leaving me restless and paranoid while shadows danced along the walls, playing tricks on my eyes. Hours passed, and just as I ready to dismiss the experience as madness, my phone buzzed to life again, illuminated under my bed like a bad omen. It was a message, devoid of context, and from an unknown number. "You're next," it read, and all rational thought slipped away as a sense of dread engulfed me, gripping tighter than the icy fingers of the creature that had briefly haunted my screen. I deleted the message, the panic bubbling in my chest as I sank deeper into a pit of uncertainty, but then my phone buzzed again, another message rapidly following: "White noise will drown your cries." Forcing myself to breathe, I realized I needed to shut down the app and shut down everything, but my thumb hesitated over the screen as the static noise gently seeped through. In mere seconds, I was paralyzed by the eerie sound, everything around me feeling less real, as if reality itself had slipped just a few degrees off center, but it was the latest message that made my pulse race: "Look outside." Against all better judgment, I turned my gaze to the window that peeked into the shadows of my backyard, heart hammering in sudden desperation, and there, in the distance, illuminated by the moonlight, stood a small figure, a child, staring directly at me with vacant eyes that glimmered as they caught the light. My breath hitched as I recognized those same twisted features from the app, and before I could process anything further, it grinned, a mouth splitting wide, revealing a gaping void where tongue should have been, and just then, the whispers crescendoed into a blood-curdling scream, echoing for eternity. I slammed the curtains shut, frantic and trembling, the color draining from my face, but outside, the laughter continued to rise, giggling children melded with shrieks that twisted into a macabre symphony. I fled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, trying desperately to snap out of the trance, reminding myself that none of this was real. But when I returned to my room, everything felt altered, distorted somehow. The shadows crawled across the walls, twisting into faces, grinning and reaching for me as I swung around the room searching for an escape. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it, heart pounding as I pushed my way into the corner, the app now a tangible entity, alive in my mind, a portal to something far darker than my imagination could fathom. I tried to breathe, attempting to find calm, but that dark figure reappeared in my mind, rotting flesh and soulless eyes, and just when I thought the terror couldn't spiral any deeper, another message popped up: "You know we can come inside." It hit me then, the game I had played had opened a gateway between this world and theirs. I scrambled to my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly to tap the screen. Just as I regained control, the app began glitching, loud bursts of static echoed like thunder in my ears, and I felt freezing claws wrap around my throat as I heard it, a chilling whisper, smooth as silk, slithering into my brain: "You can't silence us." Then, in a final attempt to escape, I placed the phone down and dove for my bedroom door, designating a route toward safety, but as the door swung open, the echoes filled my head and darkness pressed against my back, urging me to stay, pulling me under, until dawn crept through the window. But when morning finally arrived, I found myself cocooned in a thick blanket of static, the whispers softening into the same inviting lullaby that had welcomed me just a few hours earlier. I looked around, panicking as I realized I was back in bed, everything feeling oddly normal. But when I glanced at the clock, I understood time had looped, nearly 12 hours gone, and finally, as I reached for my phone on the nightstand, Reality shifted, the screen lighting up one last time to display a simple message that made my heart drop: time to play again. The last thing I remember is my fingers hovering again over that claustrophobic app, as the sound of static swelled around me once more, and the silence it defeated was replaced by a promise: this time, it would be my turn to scream. I've always been the kind of guy who brushes off superstitions, ghost stories, urban legends, tales of the unexplained. I never took any of it seriously. But all that changed when my wife, Julia, became obsessed with an old curse she stumbled upon while researching our town's history for her blog. An ancient statue, she read, stood in the depths of the nearby woods, said to be imbued with a dark power that could grant wishes, but at a horrifically steep price. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was one of those silly, harmless interests she had, something to keep her engaged after she left her corporate job. But Julia started spending more and more time at the edge of those woods, researching the statue online and scribbling feverishly in her notebook. I noticed her eerie fixation, the way she'd talk to the trees as if they were old friends, or the way her demeanor shifted whenever she mentioned the statue. Her excitement twisted into something darker. I tried to rein in her fascination, suggesting we go on hikes somewhere else, but she brushed me aside, insisting that she had to learn more about it. One evening, after a particularly intense argument, I stormed out of the house, and upon my return, I found her sitting in the living room with the notebook open to a page covered in strange symbols. I demanded to know what they meant, and the look in her eyes sent chills down my spine, deep, tumultuous, and alive with a fervor I didn't recognize. She laughed, a sound that teetered between joy and madness, and said, "Some wishes require a little sacrifice to be fulfilled, and I'm just trying to understand the balance." I wanted to laugh it off, tell her to take a step back, but the hairs on my neck stood tall. As the days passed, Julia grew more isolated, disappearing for hours at a time, always returning with dirt caked under her nails and perhaps a few peculiar trinkets she'd found: dried flowers, bones from small animals, even a tattered piece of an old doll's dress she claimed was a gift from the spirit of the woods. I googled the statue and found a photo, an unassuming figure partially obscured by vines, a grim, twisted smile twisted into its stone features. The sight warned that the curse was real, with tragic stories of those who had gotten too close, drawn in by desperate desires only to lose themselves to the darkness. As I confronted my wife one night about her obsession, she became enraged, her eyes brimming with tears as she shouted, "You don't understand. It's not just an obsession, it's my destiny." Her voice shifted, unrecognizable, with a booming echo that seemed to wrap around me like a vice. That's when I knew she was slipping away. She started to involve me in her rituals, strange gatherings in the dead of night where she'd light candles made from animal fat and chant in a language I couldn't comprehend. I refused to participate, but each time I rejected her pleas, I could see the darkness inching closer, her shadow stretching unnaturally long against the walls. Then one night, I awoke to find my side of the bed empty. Panic coursed through me as I searched the house, until I finally found her in the woods, the soft glow of the full moon illuminating the clearing where the statue stood. She was kneeling before it, whispering urgently into the dirt, hands trembling. My heart raced as I stepped closer, but as I called her name, her head snapped up, a grin spreading across her face that chilled me to my core. "I'm finally going to get what I wish for," she sang, her voice hauntingly serene. I begged her to come home, but she just stared past me, eyes glinting with an alien light. In that moment, the air thickened with desperation, and I knew, whatever she was about to do, it could destroy her. I lunged forward, but the moment I touched her shoulder, a slap of energy knocked me back. I watched in horror as she began to chant louder, the sounds warping, blooming into a cacophony of nails on chalkboard that echoed back from the trees. The world around us warped, shadows twisting and elongating, stepping from the trees as elongated figures that darted around us, their laughter like shattering glass. As she continued, I felt a pull, akin to a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to join her, to give in to the madness. I fought it, desperate to reach her, but I was frozen, my limbs heavy as a fog rolled in, wrapping around my ankles, latching firmly around my throat when I let out a cry. Just as the air crackled with tension, a booming voice from the darkness ripped through the night, "What will you sacrifice?" The words reverberated through the ground beneath us, shaking the very essence of my being. In her eyes, I saw a depth of knowledge, something ancient swirling behind them, sly and triumphant. The moment stretched into an eternity, And the darkness responded, swarming like an infectious tide as Julia's eyes began to glow, a sickening hue of sickly green. Suddenly, she turned to me, and for a brief second, the real Julia flickered behind that malignant gaze. "Help me," she whispered, and then she was gone, only the echoes of her frantic chants remaining. I made my choice then. I ran, fleeing from the woods, my mind racing to figure out how to pull her back from whatever abyss had ensnared her. But no matter where I looked, Julia was always there at the back of my mind, the way her presence faded, replaced by something insatiable that knew her every desire. Days turned to weeks as I tried to gather help, to save her, but whenever I returned to the woods, there was nothing, no sign of the gatherings, no trace of her presence, just a stillness that gnawed at my sanity. Whispers filled my nights, dreams of twisted figures and promises of power offered in exchange for my surrender. The face of the statue haunted my days, its lurking gaze peering into my very soul, whispering secrets I dared not comprehend. With every passing day, I became more certain that Julia was lost to me, drawn into the void, and whatever was left in her place was no longer human. Yet, as I lay awake in despair, I realized I could feel her urge deep within me now, her desires intertwining with my thoughts, whispering that if I only dared to return, to wish for her back, I could have her again. All it would cost is a sacrifice to the darkness, and the deeper I sank into my own nightmares, the closer I came to considering it. On the night I made my final decision, starlight illuminated the woods like jagged teeth vying to swallow me whole. As I stepped back into the clearing, I reached out to what remained of Julia, her laughter serenading me through the thicket, promising impossible things. But as I knelt before the statue, the last vestiges of my fear melted away, and the darkness coiled around me, and the whispers turned to screams, revealing the truth. To bring her back would not just be a sacrifice, it would demand everything, even my very soul. 2 weeks ago, I decided to install a new security system after becoming increasingly paranoid about strange noises in the dead of night and the feeling of being watched in my own home, a feeling that I brushed off repeatedly until a shadowy figure appeared outside my window one evening, just a fleeting glimpse that left an icy chill crawling up my spine. I thought it was just a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games, but the following nights were plagued by unsettling sounds, scratching at the door, whispers that seemed to float on the edge of hearing, and the occasional creak that echoed through the silence of my lonely house. And when my old camera system failed to capture anything, I convinced myself that I needed something more advanced, something that could truly keep me safe. After a frantic online search, I settled on a state-of-the-art security system with all the bells and whistles, including thermal imaging and facial recognition, and I eagerly set it up on a Friday evening. Feeling the rush of adrenaline as I activated the scanner and stood before it, my face lighting up the screen in a way that made me feel untouchable, as if the world outside couldn't harm me anymore. But I can still remember the way my heart sank when the screen showed a notification, "Unknown face detected," and I nearly laughed it off, thinking it must be my reflection or perhaps a glitch in the system. But as I watched the live feed, the figure appeared, hazy, distorted in the thermal imaging, but undeniably there, lurking just outside my front door where my dog barked with conviction, a thrumming jolt of fear coursing through me, and for an eternity, I hesitated, fingers hovering over my phone screen that was lined with confusing settings when I finally decided to send an alert to the authorities, but the app glitched and crashed, the reassuring beeping of the notifications faltering into a long silence as anxiety gripped me like a vice. As the hours passed, I rationalized, trying to convince myself it was a neighbor playing a prank and focusing instead on watching every corner of my live feed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as the shadows shifted, revealing a haunting outline of what I could barely recognize as a person, skin pallid and tight over the bones, sod hollow that I thought I could peek right through, and in the depth of my dread, I noticed the figure was not just watching, it was moving, sliding close to the camera, and I could see now that the glare of its eyes were dull, lost in their sockets like two remnants of something once human, an irrational thought creeping in that it wanted me to see it, to shimmy out of the darkness and into the confines of my home. So with trembling hands, I turned off the system, hoping that by denying its reality, I could escape the terror, but sleep evaded me as I lay awake, straining to catch sounds over the rhythmic thudding of my heart against my ribs. The camera remained dormant, its absence adding a surreal comfort that I hung onto tightly, believing that some things are safer left unseen, until I heard the soft click of the front door knob turning, gently, intentionally, and before I could even think of what to do, I fled to the kitchen, pressing myself against the fridge, frozen in fear, when I noticed the faint glow of my security camera booting back up, a terse face looming large on my screen and its cold breath fogging the lens, the enveloping dark of my kitchen contrasting sharply against the bright clarity of my camera, the figure now standing fully visible, its mouth stretching into a vicious smile that didn't reach those dead eyes, and as it raised a skeletal hand toward the camera, I found myself screaming into the stillness, a raw sound that felt alien against the creeping dread. I didn't dare step away from the fridge, the meager barrier between my breathing reflection and whatever monstrosity lurked less than a few feet away, but there was an overwhelming urge to escape and find refuge elsewhere, the panic surging through me as I dashed into the bathroom, locking the door, but in my haste, I glanced at my phone to order a ride or a way out, only for it to brighten my face and instead illuminate the bathroom. A dark rectangle hovered in my entryway, no longer just a figment of the camera but without a trace of warmth or humanity, and every instinct screamed for me to keep quiet as the kitchen door creaked open, the unsettling silence interrupted only by soft footsteps, pacing one step at a time, the dread pooling in my stomach until it settled heavily, and with a sudden explosion of sound, my phone pinged. The alerts I thought I would never see again flooded the screen, but they weren't from my camera, no. They were from an old neighborhood app I had forgotten about, filled with sporadic reports of break-ins and suspicious individuals lurking, and then I got a notification that made my blood run cold. Unknown face detected at your address, and the weight of fear grew unbearable as the footsteps halted, the silence consuming me like a thick fog, and just as I was about to slip into deeper panic, my phone buzzed again, the same app lighting up with fresh urgency, revealing a twist that sent my thoughts spiraling. We have confirmed a breach in your home and authorities are on the way. Please call 911 immediately if you are in danger. Tears blurred my vision as I glanced out of the small bathroom window, the quiver of the curtains directing my gaze towards the front yard where the streetlight dimly illuminated a figure standing in the shadows, unmoving and still, and then I felt it, a cold hand pressing against the back of my head through the wall, and I could hear its breath, hot and rancid, seeping into my mind as I curled into myself quietly, because I knew what I had to do. My heart raced, pounding into my ears as I fought every urge to scream, locking my gaze on my reflection in the mirror, and as I dialed 911, I prepared myself to confront whatever horror was waiting, but the screen lit up with yet another kind of fear, broadcasting the lifeless face of the wandering figure staring back through my camera, right into my soul, and in that moment, I knew, I think I need a new security system. When I first met Emily, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. She was beautiful, charming, and had a smile that lit up the room. Our whirlwind romance ended in what seemed like a fairy tale wedding, surrounded by friends and family who swore we were perfect for each other. Little did anyone know that beneath Emily's sparkling exterior lurked a darkness that would haunt me for the rest of my life. At first, it was small things, the mood swings, the fits of rage over trivial matters, and I dismissed them as stress. I convinced myself that it was just the pressures of a new marriage, but as the months rolled by, her demeanor darkened. The love letters I wrote her turned into hostile messages as she would lash out over utterly innocuous topics. The woman I had married began to unravel into something monstrous, a stranger filled with venom and resentment. I became the unwilling target of her rage, and every night I would lie awake, counting the seconds until sunrise, praying she wouldn't come home drunk from her late-night escapades. Then came the night I found the texts on her phone, messages to a man, detailing sordid affairs and sinister plans that throbbed with a chilling familiarity. I confronted her, and in a deranged frenzy, she warped the entire conversation, painting me as a villain for simply wanting monogamy. That was the moment I realized there was no turning back. I'd opened Pandora's box, and in doing so, I had given her the power to destroy me. This power, jagged and twisted, pushed me deeper into a cocoon of despair but also sparked something dark in me. I fantasized about escape, about breaking free from the shackles of my so-called life. The idea morphed from a flicker into a fire. I couldn't let myself be the victim any longer. I executed a plan so meticulously that it almost felt like art. I began isolating her, manipulating her friends against her, twisting their perceptions until she was a pariah among those who once adored her. It was easy. Emily had the uncanny ability to alienate everyone around her with her bitter tongue. A small part of me winced at the betrayal of our vows, but the rest of me reveled in it. It felt empowering, exhilarating, as I wielded the situation like a puppeteer off the stage. Once her social life crumbled, I waited for the right moment, a moment that glowed red in my mind and what I saw as justice. I planned the night down to the last detail, the wine laced with poison that would leave her with no pain, just an eternal sleep that would never wake her up. That night, she walked into our home, her gaze shifting from sullen and angry to disoriented as I greeted her with a warm apex of affection. I poured us both a glass, the crimson liquid swirling like blood in the low light, and we raised our glasses to toast. Her glass, heavier now with a burden she would never comprehend, glimmered as she took the decisive sip. Moments later, her eyes glazed over, and she slumped forward, the flicker of venom turned into eternal darkness as I cradled her head in my lap, whispering sweet nothings while she slipped away. As I watched her eyes dim, I felt a surge of relief, of vindication that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I had done it, I had liberated myself from the torment. The aftermath was surprisingly mundane. I dealt with the police, the body, and the investigation with a calm that unnerved even the most seasoned detectives. Numb from the adrenaline, I employed my charm like a well-honed weapon, convincing everyone of my innocence and portraying myself as the grieving husband. While they scrutinized the scene, the whispers of my guilt danced beneath the surface of polite conversation. Days turned into weeks, and I wandered through life as if I was invincible, believing I had escaped the clutches of justice. I went to parks, made small talk with neighbors, even engaged in mundane banter about the weather without a hitch. But the shadow of my actions hung heavy over me like a shroud, a constant reminder of the life I had snuffed out. The elation began to fester, morphing into paranoia. I could feel eyes on me, the walls whispering secrets, birds and trees judging me. Nights became sleepless, riddled with nightmares that painted Emily's face, contorted in pain and betrayal, haunting me with a specter I couldn't shake. And then, the letters started showing up, tucked under my door, written in a handwriting I recognized too well. At first, I thought they were some twisted joke or someone's idea of a sick prank, but each letter was a chilling reminder of my crimes, slashing through the veil of complacency I'd woven around myself. The letters urged me to reconsider my actions. They called me a coward, a murderer, unworthy of my freedom. They detailed instances of my life with Emily from moments only she would know, capturing the essence of a love twisted into horror. Each message carried the weight of her voice, shaking me to my core, echoing through the empty chambers of our house where her laughter once reigned. I began checking over my shoulder, convinced that someone knew more about that night than I imagined. Then, one evening, after scouring the house for hidden cameras and traps, I sat alone in my living room, staring blankly at a wall as shadows crept around me. I felt the very air shift, a chill creeping down my spine, and I swore I could hear faint whispers echoing through the house. In the depths of my paranoia, I became a captive in my own mind, convinced the ghost of Emily was haunting me, circling closer and closer, ready to exact her non-existent revenge. The final straw came when I returned home to see her. She was sitting in my favorite chair, legs crossed with that same smirk that had once ignited desire inside me, now radiating malice. My heart raced as I stumbled backward into a corner, staring at the apparition. The room darkened, shadows enveloping her until she was the literal embodiment of despair, taunting me with the very essence of my crime. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" she whispered. "We'll always be together, my love. You can't kill what never dies." The darkness thickened around me, and as my screams echoed against the walls, they morphed into laughter, her laughter, echoing through the empty hallways of my mind. I realized then that I had never truly killed her, I had merely birthed something worse, a torment that would follow me until my last breath. And so, as I sit here penning these words, a weight in my chest, the ever-present reminder that she is with me still, I can't help but smile. Because despite it all, I don't regret a thing. Her love was as much a curse as it was a blessing, and I made my choice. I freed myself into a life bound not by fear, but by the eternal echo of laughter, a haunting symphony I'll never escape, nor will I ever want to. I'll enter any home at the right price. It might sound like a line from a cheap advertisement, but it's the mantra I've lived by for the last 3 years as a freelance locksmith, a profession that gives me the unique ability to slip into places most people would never have the courage, or perhaps the insanity, to enter, usually with a well-paying client backing me up. My clients often have their reasons for hiring me. Sometimes it's a simple lockout, other times it's a spouse clearing out the belongings of someone who's moved on without a word. Whatever the situation, I've prided myself on my discretion and professionalism, but yesterday, everything changed. It began with a call from a frantic woman in tears, her voice trembling as she explained she needed me to get into her late grandmother's house. The estate had already been settled, and she promised me it would be just a 30-minute job, A good sum of cash exchanged for opening a door. As I drove to the old Victorian mansion, which was caked with peeling paint and an aura of neglect, the storm clouds began to gather above, casting dark shadows over the landscape. When I arrived, the wind whistled as it passed through the gnarled branches of the ancient oaks that line the driveway. The woman, whose name was Claire, was waiting at the entrance, her face pale and drawn. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "You have to understand, my grandmother was different. Sometimes she would talk about strange things." I nodded, already grasping the supernatural undertones she was hinting at, though I thought it might just be a morning mind concocting ghosts. Once inside the house, the temperature dropped significantly, and I felt a shiver race down my spine. The interior was a museum of forgotten memories, with dust dancing in the air where sunlight dared not penetrate its layers. As I set to work on the antique clocks, Claire continued to talk, recounting tales of her grandmother's obsessions, rituals involving salt circles and strange stones, whispers of spirits that would come to visit at night. At first, I chuckled at her eccentricity, believing it belonged to a bygone era. But when I finally unlocked the door to the attic, I felt an unexpected wave of unease wash over me. As we ascended the creaky stairs, a feeling of dread coiled in my stomach, the air here thick with something indefinable. The attic was cluttered with old trunks and forgotten odds and ends, but in the middle of it all sat a wide, round table covered with a dusty red cloth. Centered on the table was a series of peculiar symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood, surrounding an ancient mirror that seemed to pulse with energy. I stepped closer, hypnotized, wondering who or what had capped those marks with such dedicated fervor. "Please be careful," Claire gasped, her voice barely a whisper now. I turned to tell her it was just an old mirror, but I didn't get the chance. Just then, the weather outside shifted, and a violent gust of wind shoved the attic door shut behind us, plunging the room into an uneasy silence. Suddenly, the glass of the mirror rippled as if something were alive behind it, and when I glanced at Claire, I noticed her face was pale and unresponsive, almost as if she were being drawn into its depths alongside the shadows that gathered. I attempted to shake her from her trance, but the moment I touched her shoulder, a loud crack echoed in the room, like thunder, but more sinister. Outside, the storm had unleashed its full force, and I could hear the rain banging against the windows like 1,000 frantic hands desperate to get in. In a panic, I grabbed Claire and pushed toward the door, but the mirror seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light, and for a brief moment, I saw flashes of twisted faces, wailing mouths, frozen in timeless agony. I've always seen ghosts as mere figments of the imagination, but with each reflection, I felt a cold grasp tightening around my heart, a sense that something had marked us. Finally, we burst through the door and rushed down the stairs, the air feeling heavier with each step. The wind howled madly, branches thrashed against the windows like prison bars shaking in their frames. I thought about leaving right then, to turning back and never looking at that house again, but Claire was in distress, and against every instinct I was trying to fight, the thought of abandoning her felt wrong. We stumbled into the living room, where a pale figure flickered momentarily at the edge of my vision, only to vanish when I turned to look right at it. Just as panic settled in my chest, Claire suddenly reached for an old photo frame, her hand trembling. "My grandmother. She warned me to never answer the door after sunset," she said, gazing wide-eyed at the faded photograph of a woman I now recognized as her grandmother, her gaze piercing like a solemn declaration that sent dread rippling through my core. "Mom always said she could see things others couldn't." In that moment, a loud crash sounded from the attic, like the world up there had shattered into chaos. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, frantically thinking about how to escape, to run away from the sinister lure that haunted this place. As we bolted from the house, I realized we were no longer just escaping a physical building, we were fleeing an unseen force, a hunger ignited by curiosity and dark promise that seemed to pull at us, trying to keep us tethered to whatever horrors my drilled mind could barely comprehend. We lingered outside in the torrential rain, drenched and panting, the house looming behind us like a predator that had nearly claimed its prey. Claire stared at the front door, her expression a mix of anger and despair. "We have to go back," she said, conviction lacing her words. "I can feel her. She needs me." Before I could protest, Claire dashed back toward the threshold, and I was left torn. My instincts screamed to hold her back, to scream at the helplessness of my experiences, but something darker twisted in my gut, urging me onward as I chased her into the storm of confusion. Once back inside, The air felt different, it crackled with electricity, unsettling pulsations reverberating within me each step we took. We raced back to the attic. The symbols had begun to glow when we returned, altering rapidly like DNA in mutation. "Find her," Claire cried out, her voice breaking, and I quickly realized we weren't just in some twisted game, we were unwitting players of a more sinister legacy, led by this ancient mirror and the restless spirit that demanded homage. The pressure built within me as I began tearing through the rooms, through dusty boxes and scattered remnants of a life once lived, until I stumbled upon a letter that fell from the pages of an old book. Unfolding it, I recognized Claire's grandmother's handwriting, describing how she had formed a bond with something unnatural, a pact that had drawn power from each generation of the family, feeding off their fears and sorrows. The words sent a chill down my spine as I glanced back at Claire, who stood motionless before the mirror, entranced as its light twisted her silhouette into grotesque forms. Time lost meaning, and I realized with horror that I was standing at the precipice, teetering on the edge of a choice, to abandon the woman I wasn't allowed to care about or to delve deeper into a world that could engulf even the sanctity of my profession. In one heart-stopping moment, I lunged forward, grabbing her hand, but my efforts were silenced as Claire's scream punctured the night. "It's too late," she wailed, the realization breaking through the surface, but even that echo was swallowed by a silence that stretched on long after the last thunder had rolled away, leaving only the soft creak of the house as it breathed, alive and watching us. The finality settled in, wrapping around us, whispering the forbidden truth that some doors are never meant to be opened, leaving me with a grotesque memory burning in my heart, the kind that gnaws and whispers through dreams of wandering paths and blood-stained mirrors. Today, I find myself wearing my locksmith's uniform, but every time the phone rings now, sending a jolt through my being, I hesitate. The notion of the right price feels distant now, tainted by the shadows of what I cannot escape. I'll enter any home they say, yet in my mind echoes that one thought: I don't know what lurks behind those walls anymore. When my daughter Mia decided to explore the dark, dusty corners of our old attic one rainy afternoon, I didn't think much of it at first. She was a curious 8-year-old with a wild imagination, and the attic was her forbidden treasure chest of family heirlooms and forgotten memories. But when she stumbled upon an old, heavy canvas hidden behind a tattered trunk, I instantly felt an unsettling chill ripple through the air, a sense that something about it wasn't quite right. It was an eerie painting of a little girl with large, hollow eyes and a distorted smile that seemed too wide for her thin face, dressed in a once white dress now stained with something dark and unidentifiable. At first, Mia was fascinated by its strange beauty, but as she held it closer, her expression shifted from awe to something I couldn't quite place, a flickering shadow of fear, perhaps? I waved off my unease as just nerves, but then I noticed the way her small hands trembled as she laid it across her lap, her eyes becoming glassy, tears threatening to spill over. "Daddy, she looks lonely," Mia whispered, her little voice quaking. I lifted the painting, intending to take it back to where we found it, but a strange feeling rooted me to the spot, as if the painting was pleading for release from its dusty confines. The moment I set it against the wall, those hollow eyes seemed to bore into mine, and the atmosphere of the attic shifted, thickening with an emotion I couldn't identify. I felt a pull, an inexplicable connection, but it scared me. I told Mia we should put the painting back, but she sobbed, clinging to it like it was a lifeline, saying she didn't want to leave her new friend behind. I attempted to reason with her, but each time I touched her, the warmth of her body cooled, and it was like a shadow had wrapped around her heart, squeezing tight. In the following days, Mia's obsession with the painting deepened. She wouldn't let it out of her sight, dragging it with her to the dinner table and talking to it as if it were alive, giving it a name, Isabel. I tried to intervene, but her cries of despair shrouded my parental instincts. She would sit in her room for hours, talking and laughing softly to Isabel, but when she looked at me, I saw that flicker of fear had turned into something more sinister, a glimpse of the abyss creeping into her young mind. I began to hear whispers in the corners of the house when I was alone, a dissonance that made the hair on my neck stand on end, murmurs I couldn't quite catch but felt resonating in my bones. Late one night, I awoke to find Mia's light on, her room glowing a ghastly yellow. I tiptoed down the hallway, heart racing as I peeked through her door and saw her slumped over, clutching the painting tightly as if her life depended on it, tears streaming down her face as she sobbed, "Why won't you play with me?" My breath hitched. I felt as though someone were watching us, the chill creeping up my spine like icy fingers brushing my skin. Just as I was about to go in and take that sinister thing away, I heard a voice, Soft, melodic, but impossibly cold, whisper from the shadows, "She's mine now." A feeling of dread washed over me. I stumbled back, heart pounding like a war drum, and the moment I turned to flee, I felt the air grow heavy, the silence thickening around me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being pawed by icy hands, and when I finally made it to the safety of my room and pulled the blankets up to my chin, I could still hear Mia's cries echoing in the night. The next day I made a decisive choice. I needed to get the painting out of my house or risk losing my daughter forever. I crept back into the attic, ready to take that thing and burn it, but as I lifted it, the painting felt impossibly heavy, and a wave of despair enveloped me, as if Isabel herself were pulling me into her void. Unwillingly, I found myself staring at the painted girl, her grin now impossibly wide, eyes glimmering with a darkness that threatened to swallow the light. It was only then that I noticed a bizarre detail, a small signature tucked away at the bottom corner of the canvas, "Maria Lowry, dated 1953. A chill crept through my veins as I realized the name. It belonged to a girl who had disappeared on a rainy day, decades ago, with never a trace left behind. The stories whispered through my childhood echoed painfully in my mind, tales of a vengeful spirit seeking companionship, fueled by the suffering of a lost soul. Heart racing, I dropped the painting like it were on fire, my fear palpable, but as I turned to leave, I heard Mia's voice flutter from behind me, "Eden." It was a name that sent the chill back into my core, a name that echoed long-lost memories now flooding back. "Daddy. Look. Isabel's not alone." I whipped around in horror. Mia was standing in the attic doorway, with her small, innocent hand pointing proudly to the painting. It was not just the girl now, but another child emerging beside her, my daughter, with an ethereal glow that made her look almost like a ghost. "She's my sister, Daddy. We're playing." In that moment, I felt like the ground had slipped from beneath my feet as Mia rushed forward, intoxicating laughter ringing in the stillness of the attic, and as I tried to scream her name, a presence behind me pushed me, hard, sending me spiraling into darkness. Desperate, I crawled back, pain flooding my body, but when I turned, I was greeted by the painting staring down at me, a bond forged in misery and loss that threatened to consume my daughter's soul. I was powerless against it as everything slipped away, her cries, her laughter, every shred of love and light in her eyes extinguished as I grappled with this twisted, parasitic force. All that remained was the painting, now draped in shadows. While I lay trapped in an endless night that wasn't meant for me, I was left with the dreadful realization that the only way to save Mia was to erase every trace of Isabel from existence. How could I do that when the price of that decision meant sacrificing my own flesh and blood? From that day on, I wake each morning to a hollow silence where my daughter used to laugh. I hear the echoes of Isabel's cries, an agonizing reminder of the bond forged between a lost child and the one I should have saved. But I know she lives on, trapped in that wretched painting, while I, the father who failed, am left to carry the burden of what we lost forever. I always thought my training as an exorcist would prepare me for everything, until that night in the abandoned church at the edge of town, where whispers of a malevolent entity swirled like a thick fog. The place was desolate, clad in shadows that seemed to swallow all light, and even the moon above hesitated to shine on it, as if it sensed the malevolence lurking beneath the rotting floorboards. My mentor, Father Malone, a man with grave eyes and a voice that could command respect from the dead, led me into the belly of the beast with a quiet confidence I longed to emulate. "It's a spirit unlike any we've encountered," he had warned, his breath forming icy mists in the night. I had shrugged off his words, eager to prove my worth. Little did I know, the whispers were not mere figments of the imagination but an invitation to despair. Each echoed call a lament from those who had entered, and never returned. As we set up our makeshift altar, arranging candles that flickered like uncertain hearts, I felt an encroaching dread, a weight pressing on my chest as if the very air turned hostile. The temperature dropped abruptly, breath curling in shivers, and I shone my flashlight towards the dilapidated altar, revealing an inscription that chilled my blood, "Behold the unnameable." Father Malone's voice broke the silence as he began the incantation. But before we could even finish, a raw, guttural laugh exploded from the nave. It set my skin on fire and sent streams of ice down my spine. I risked a glance, only to see an unnatural twist of shadows coalesce into a figure with eyes like burning coals, a smile too wide for any human mouth. This wasn't a demon, it was something far worse, a shapeshifter, reveling in its power, relishing our terror. It lunged, and Father Malone was suddenly gone, engulfed by a vortex of darkness, screaming words of protection that echoed away too quickly. Alone, with the shadows dancing like twisted marionettes, I felt every ounce of my training slip through my fingers as it closed in. I could hear the whispers now, desperately pleading requests of souls bound to the very ground we stood upon, a chorus of despair that only fueled my fear. I wrapped my hands around my rosary, scrambling to recite the exorcism prayers, but the laughter intermingled with my words, drowning them out, turning my faith against me. It pulled me into its whirlwind, showing me visions of my past failures, friends lost through my negligence, each face distorted with grief and accusation. I fell, collapsing beneath the weight of my own fears, and just as I thought all hope was lost, I heard Father Malone's voice echoing once more, though it was distorted and warped by agony. "Find your faith," he cried, and in that moment, clarity broke through the fog of despair. I grasped the memories of every prayer, every piece of scripture burned into my mind, bolstered by the love for those I had lost. Rising to my feet, I faced the creature, rage igniting a fire within me, drowning out the whispers that sought to pull me back into darkness. "In the name of God, I command you!" I screamed, forcing the words through gritted teeth, feeling the very essence of my being surge with a power I had only glimpsed during training. Light erupted from the candles, forming a protective circle, and for the first time, the creature shrank back, its horrid face flickering like a candle in the wind. "You can't hide from me!" it shrieked, though I could tell it was losing its grip. Sensing my trembling but determined demeanor, it morphed into a twisted reflection of myself, mocking, beer-faced, filled with the darkest parts of my insecurities. "You think you can defeat me? You're just as worthless," it taunted, spewing venomous words that struck like blades aimed at my heart. But with each insult, I grew stronger. I could almost envision Father Malone standing beside me in unwavering support. Channeling everything I loved, I defined my faith, reciting the prayers with a fervor I didn't know I possessed, my voice harmonizing with the cries of the forgotten souls. The structure of the church began to tremble, and the entity screeched as brilliant light enveloped it, twisting the shadows until they imploded in upon themselves, breaking the malignant grip it held over this cursed place. The creature faded, its laughter replaced with agonized wails, until silence reigned where chaos once lingered. But just as I gathered my breath, glancing around the now empty church, an ominous chill crawled over me. In the depths of that silence, I realized it wasn't over. I could still feel its presence lingering at the edge of my consciousness, an echo teasing me from beyond the veil, whispering secrets of despair that promised it would return when I least expected it. I stumbled out of the church, heart racing, knowing my training was far from over. Whatever that entity was, it didn't just disappear. It had marked me, and from now on, I would not only be an exorcist in training, I would be a target, living as a vessel for something that craved fear, that took my deepest vulnerabilities and twisted them into chains I could only hope to break. As I drove home, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of a shadow in the rearview mirror, but when I looked again, it was gone, just like that dreadful laughter, just like the way Father Malone vanished without a trace. Now, every night, the sound of whispers fills my mind, and I am left to wonder, when will it come back, and when it does, am I ready to face it again? For as long as I can remember, Stanville Creek has been the stuff of local legend, a place shrouded in whispers and half-truths that seeped through tight-lipped townsfolk like water through cupped hands. Nestled just beyond the edge of my small town, it was the type of creek that looked innocent enough, a winding ribbon of crystal-clear water meandering lazily through sun-dappled woods, but families warned their children to steer clear of it, especially at dusk when shadows grew long and the wind carried secrets not meant for human ears. As a child, I'd often ridden my bike past it, curiosity prickling at my spine, while my friends dared each other to approach its banks, mesmerized by the enchanting glow that emanated from its depths at twilight. Those who dared to venture too close spoke of catching glimpses of something that didn't belong, a swirl of dark fabric that hung beneath the surface as if a figure was watching, waiting. But I didn't believe the stories. I dismissed them as childish tales, spun by imaginations too wild for the safe confines of our radio-static town. Then, last summer, after my best friend Cam disappeared, I was left with a hollowness that echoed louder than any childhood fear. It wasn't the first time someone had vanished near the creek. The town had a history, one that was often buried under layers of denial, an unspoken understanding that some things were better left undiscovered. So, the day I decided to search for Cam at Stanville Creek, I packed a flashlight, my old baseball bat, and every ounce of resolve I could muster. The going was slow, the heat made the air thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket as I pushed through the underbrush until the creek unfolded before me in its serene malaise. I stepped carefully towards the water, every snap of a twig echoing ominously around me, and that's when I saw it, the glow. It flickered beneath the surface like a firefly trapped in a jar, beckoning me with promises of answers I craved. Compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I knelt at the bank, peering into the murky water as it whispered secrets to me. I could swear I saw shapes writhing, twisted figures cloaked in shadows, but one shape stood out, a hand, pale and fragile, grasping upward as if trying to escape the depths. I immediately thought of Cam, of his laughter that once filled the air, now replaced by an agonizing silence that consumed me. My heart raced as I splashed water, yelling his name, desperate for a sign, any sign that he was safe. The creek gurgled back, indifferent to my pleas, and I felt a chill creep up my spine, an instinctual warning that this was not a game I could win. I nearly turned to flee, to return to the safety of the dirt road when a voice, soft and lilting like the sound of wind chimes, danced on the edge of my consciousness. "Help me," it sang, the word curling around me like fog, impossible to resist. My mind wrestled with doubt, yet I plunged my hand into the cold water, feeling it pull me closer to whatever lay below. As I plunged deeper, I realized the glow intensified, swirling around me like ethereal ribbons. Time slipped away, the world above dissolved into nothing. I gasped when I felt something encircle my wrist, the grip sending my heart into a frenzy. I was certainly not ready for the sight that followed, a face emerging from the depths, impossibly familiar, a reflection of Cam made haunting and grotesque. His eyes held mine, swirling with panic that turned to a macabre smile as he said, "You found me." The world shifted, and I realized too late that Cam was not the boy I remembered. He wore an echo of himself, a fragment of laughter overlaid with despair. I struggled against the water's grip, but it was too late. The current yanked me under, pulling me into a frigid embrace that stole my breath away. I felt ice clawing at my veins, the pull of the deep more powerful than my fear, and I heard the laughter of unseen voices stitching itself into a cacophony around me. And then, the ground beneath me vanished entirely, and I was falling through darkness that swallowed every shred of light, every scream, every desperate thought, until I could distinguish nothing but Cam's horrendous laughter resonating in the abyss. When I awoke, it was on the banks of Stanville Creek, the sun low in the sky casting an eerie glow that felt too warm against my chilled skin. My heart raced. Had it all been a dream, an echo of nightmares born from the grief of losing Cam? But the shadows danced on the edges of my vision, teasing me with memories I couldn't fully grasp. As I stumbled to my feet, something glimmered in the mud nearby, and my breath caught in my throat as I recognized it, Cam's bracelet, the one he had worn every day. Panic surged, and I frantically searched the area, calling his name again and again, but the creek lay in mocking silence, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting nothing but the sky. Shadows lengthened around me, wrapping tighter with each passing second, as I felt a dreadful understanding seep into my bones. Something had shifted in my world. Stanville Creek was no longer just a story, a whisper on the wind. It had ensnared me in its dark tale, and from the woods, I could sense a pair of eyes watching, waiting, perhaps even counting the number of days until I too became a part of its dreadful legacy. They never listen. They never believe. But I'll keep trying, because that's all I can do. That's all I've ever been able to do. It all started on that warm July afternoon when the sun hung low like a giant, bloated eye watching over Maplewood, a town where nothing ever happened, and secrets ebbed beneath the surface like water trying to hide from the sun. I was just 15, a skinny kid with overgrown hair and an imagination that always seemed to run wild, but by the time the school bell rang, that day was already tainted with a dread I couldn't shake. My friends had planned to head to the lake, but instead, I found myself wandering the wooded trails behind my house, hoping to clear my head. I leaned against a massive oak tree, my fingers tracing the rough bark, when I noticed a clearing a few dozen feet away that I was sure hadn't existed before. Curiosity tugged at me, and I stepped closer. In the center, there was an old well, stone and crumbling, half buried in vines. I peered down and saw nothing but darkness, an emptiness so profound it felt like the pit of an endless void. I called out, feeling foolish, but I thought I heard a whisper, a soft plea blending with the rustling leaves. It chilled me, but I pushed it aside and rushed home, eager to share my discovery. I burst through the door, my words tumbling over one another, but my mother just glanced up from her book and returned to her pages, dismissing me as usual. "It's just a well," she said, yawning. "There are tons of them around." My friends laughed, hurling jokes my way, and even though their teasing should have stung, I felt a different kind of urgency, like an alarm ringing in my bones. I had to go back. That night, unable to sleep, I slipped out of my house and wandered into the woods, following the moonlight. The well loomed larger than before, shadows sprawled across the ground like fingers reaching out to pull me in. I stood there, captivated by an inexplicable force, and when I leaned closer to the well, the whisper came again, distinct now, beckoning me. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but curiosity chained my feet to the spot. I tossed in a pebble, but instead of the expected splash, all I felt was a weight pressing down, as though the well had absorbed my offering. "Help me," the voice pleaded. "I'm trapped." I staggered back, heart racing. No one would believe me, nobody ever did. But I had to do something. I ran home, grabbed an old flashlight, and bolted back to the well, my heart pounding like a war drum as the light flickered and emitted a soft glow against the inky dark. "Who are you?" I shouted down the well, my voice echoing around me. "What's down there?" A moment passed, silence wrapping around me like a shroud, and just as I was about to turn away in despair, the voice surged back, frail yet unmistakable. "I was forgotten. They locked me away and left me to die." I trembled. Was it a ghost? Or something worse? I considered calling for help, but no one would believe me. They'd say I was just a kid with a wild imagination. Instead, I leaned closer, the cold air crawling into my bones, and asked, "How do I help you?" "You must lower something, anything, to reach me," it replied. "And when you do, believe." The urgency of those words clung to my mind, and I began rummaging through my pockets, desperate for something to offer. I found an old bottle cap from the soda I'd had earlier, and without thinking, I tied it to a long piece of string. It was pathetic, hardly worth a single glance, but I lowered it, watching the cap descend, and as it disappeared into the darkness, the well seemed to pulse, an almost grateful shiver coursing through the ground. I pulled the cap back up, only to find it coated in an oily substance like something that should never exist in this world. Panic rose in my throat, but I couldn't stop now. The thought of leaving that voice down there, alone and dying, drove me onward. "What's your name?" I yelled, trying to break the unease wrap around my chest. "Kara," it replied, its voice clearer, rising like smoke. Just a girl who never had the chance to escape. I felt a sharp pang of empathy, but doubt crept in. Could she be lying? I didn't have the luxury of time or the strength of belief the voice demanded, but as the days passed, Kara became my silent accomplice in the solitude of my teenage life. I'd visit the clearing every night, trying to convince myself it wasn't madness. My friends continued to dismiss me, even my best friend Alex rolled his eyes when I dragged him along. "Dude, it's a freaking well. Let's go get pizza instead," he said, and I felt like I had lost my chance to search for whatever freedom I thought I could bring to her. But I couldn't let go. I decided that I wouldn't let their disbelief silence me. On the 10th night, I returned with a backpack full of stones, my stomach churning with the prospect of my plan. I hoisted the first stone over the well and yelled, "Kara, I'm coming." And as it struck the bottom, the voice returned, urgent and gasping, "More. You must believe. Bring me something more." The ground shook, branches cracked, and I could swear a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I dropped stone after stone, the earth shifting beneath my feet until the last stone sank with a sickening thud. "Kara," I cried out. "Are you still there?" "Yes. You're close. But you need to believe harder. You need to jump." For a heartbeat, I hesitated. Jump? What did she mean? I was standing right on the edge of madness. The cold wind pulled at me, whispering doubts, but every flickering light in my memory, the thoughts of her trapped, begging for freedom, heated my blood. I gulped down fear, my heart a wild beast, and leapt toward the gaping maw of the void. I felt weightless for an instant before landing crouched on a damp stone floor, breathless and disoriented. The darkness surrounded me, and an overwhelming smell of decay filled my lungs. "Kara?" I called, panic clawing at my insides. There was only silence, a stillness that felt ancient and malevolent. The voice was gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet. I tried to rise, but the ground felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. That's when I realized, in the darkness, shadows formed shapes that coiled and twisted, anchoring me in place. You shouldn't have come here, a whisper lingered, colder than I could bear. And then I saw her, shadowy and translucent, her smile a twisted mockery. You were never supposed to believe. I lost that power ages ago. The realization crushed me like a stone, and the last flicker of hope extinguished in my chest. The darkness thickened, becoming something sentient, swallowing every glint of light. I screamed, thrashing against the grip of the nightmare that had ensnared me, but deep down, a part of me understood. They never listen, never believe, and maybe they were right to stay away. Because once you step into the shadows, they consume everything you are, and I was no longer just trying to save a girl, I had become another whisper in the abyss, waiting for the next fool to come along who might foolishly believe. Now, I am the voice calling from the well, reminding you that knowing the truth can be the lost key to your freedom, but in this world, knowledge often comes at a horrible price, the price of listening, believing, and jumping into the unknown. I always prided myself on being a rational person, the kind who sees through the absurd trends that circulate the internet, but one lonely Friday night, while scrolling mindlessly through social media, I stumbled upon a challenge that claimed to reveal your true self. Naturally, it piqued my interest. The challenge, dubbed the reflection, was simple enough: find a mirror at midnight, repeat your name 3 times, and ask it if you were truly who you thought you were, expecting nothing more than a quirky experience to share later with friends. I chuckled at the ridiculousness of it, but then the voice in my head, the one that always pushed me to take risks, whispered that if I could pull off this stupid challenge, maybe I'd have a great story to tell. So, at precisely 12 a.m., I tiptoed into the dim light of my bathroom, the air laden with anticipation and an odd sense of dread, my heart thumping as I flicked on the overhead light and watched my reflection flicker to life. The glass seemed oddly clouded, like the world outside on a foggy morning, but I brushed it off and steadied my trembling hands. With each call of my name, Jake, 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 the moment felt lighter, more whimsical, until suddenly, an unfathomable chill washed over me, freezing my breath in the cramped bathroom. The reflection didn't shift or smile back, instead, it held a vacant stare, an emptiness that sent a shiver down my spine. I blinked, and when my eyes opened again, something had changed. It was like I was staring into a pit, an abyss of darkness where my own reflection once stood, and that's when I heard it, soft at first, like a whisper but growing louder, a cacophony of voices calling my name in sickly sweet unison, urging me to step closer. They spoke of truths I had never dared to explore, secrets I kept buried under the weight of expectation, and suddenly, my resolve faltered. I stepped closer as one voice surged above the rest, promising me clarity if only I would reach out and touch the glass. My instincts screamed at me to run, that this was no innocent game or fleeting thrill, but all reason slipped away as my fingers grazed the cold surface. Immediately, my own reflection changed, eyes glazing over with an unholy light, and twisted into a mockery of myself, grinning impossibly wide, as if it relished my confusion. Panic set in, but before I could retract my hand or scream, the mirror warped and pulled me into its depths, plunging me into an infinite space devoid of sound, sight, and even thought, as if I existed but didn't at the same time. I fell, or I floated, I couldn't tell, but I became aware of the whispers again, now louder, their words sharp and piercing, dragging me deeper into the shadows as I fought to comprehend my surroundings. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the void absorbed my pleas, turning my voice into desperate echoes that ricocheted mercilessly around me. Days felt like years in that timeless nightmare as I was haunted by fragments of my life. These glimpses of my past grew twisted, the closeness of loved ones emerged with rotten faces, friends who laughed at my jokes turning to corpses in mid-laugh, while the darkness fed off my anguish. I thought of my mother, of long-forgotten promises. I remembered how, as a child, I was told that if you ever stared too long into the abyss would stare back into you, and by the time the thought crossed my mind, I understood the weight of those words too late. I saw flashes of my reflection once more, not the one I recognized, but one filled with malice and deceit, whispering lies that twisted my memories into dark fables, feeding my despair. The possessions that once brought joy now morphed into chains, dragging me down into this abyss that felt all-consuming. I fought against the tide, clawing and screaming until my throat went raw, desperately searching for a way back to my reality, but the urging voices only became louder, filling my mind with despair. You wanted the truth, they taunted, plea and malice interwoven in their tones. The truth is that you're nothing. Just as I was about to drown in the shadows, suddenly, a blinding light burst forth, splitting the void and throwing me back through the wooden frame of that bathroom mirror. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the air settled back around me like a damp blanket, but something was wrong. I could still hear the whispers, their resonance now an irremovable echo embedded in my mind. My reflection was back to normal, but I knew better. I had brought something back with me, something lingering beyond the veil of my reality, and I was not alone. Days morphed into weeks as the whispers clung to me relentlessly, merging into my thoughts, popping up when I least expected it, grasping at my sanity like ravenous wolves fighting over a meal. I tried to shake them off, with distractions, friends, and all the noise I could muster, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had unleashed something by answering the mirror's call, a part of myself forever ensnared in the fabric of that horror. Late one night, unable to pull myself from the suffocating dread, I stood before my mirror again, not intending to engage but unable to resist its pull, and there it was, the flicker of distortion that made my heart race with a familiar panic. It was taunting me, and through the glass, I swore I could see the faint outline of the darkness I had wrestled with first. It promised me secrets and truths unfiltered, all that I had hidden and feared, and as I raised my trembling hand toward the mirror, guilt washed over me like a tidal wave as I realized I had miscalculated the most dangerous aspect of that foolish challenge, that sometimes, the truth isn't meant to be uncovered, it's a thing to be feared, because once you see it, it can never truly let you go. I was sitting on my couch, trying to figure out what to watch on Netflix, when I received a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She had asked me long ago if I could babysit her 8-year-old daughter, Lily, while she and her husband went out for a dinner party. At first, I thought it was a pretty normal request. I had often seen Lily playing in the yard, a sweet girl with curly hair and a knack for crafting paper dolls. But now, the message that popped up on my screen made my blood run cold. Just got to warn you, don't let her show you the drawings. At first, I thought it was just a quirky joke, maybe a reference to some childlike doodles, so I shot back a casual, sure thing. No drawings, got it. But her reply came almost instantaneously, an anxious string of words. No, really, I mean it. They're not right. Something isn't right with them. Just be careful, okay? I chuckled nervously, half convinced it was some kind of overprotective parent thing, but unease crept in as I considered the tone of her messages. By the time Mrs. Patterson arrived to drop off Lily, I could hardly shake the creeping anxiousness that settled in me like a thick fog. Lily was in bright pink overalls, an adorable smile stretching across her face as she waved at me excitedly, and when I welcomed her inside, I noticed the warm, inviting home seemed a bit colder with her absence. As the evening dragged on, I tried to distract myself by making popcorn and turning on a movie. But every so often, Lily would get up and wander off, rummaging through her room or the den, giggling to herself, making the hair on my neck stand up. I told myself it was just a kid being silly until I overheard her humming a tune that sent chills down my spine. It was one I had never heard before and felt almost wrong to listen to. "What's that song, Lily?" I asked, unsure whether I wanted to hear her answer. "It's my special song," she replied with an innocent grin that seemed to stretch a bit too widely. "My friends sing it, too." I felt a shudder run through me as she spoke. Before I could think too much about it, she disappeared again, and this time I couldn't help but follow. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and I peeked in to find her sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by crumpled sheets of paper which were covered in wild scribbles that bore no resemblance to anything familiar. At first, I thought it was just chaos, something only a child could conjure, but on closer inspection, I found it unsettling. There were grotesque figures with bulging eyes and twisted smiles, their limbs unnaturally stretched, and something about them seemed to move as I stared. My heart raced as I stepped back, knocking on a few crayons scattered by my feet and sending them clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. Lily looked up at me, her expression shifting into a serious frown. "You're not supposed to see those," she said, her voice a bizarre mix of a child's whisper and something far older and darker, and I could feel the air grow heavy. I quickly offered a light laugh, trying to brush off my discomfort. "It's okay, we can play something else. How about?" But she interrupted me, her eyes widening and transforming into an eerie expression that knocked the breath out of me. "If you don't like my pictures, then you won't like my friends," she said, standing up in one quick motion, leaving the drawings behind as she grabbed my hand and pulled me out of the room. I wanted to resist, to tell her to let me go, but it was as if an unseen force was compelling me forward. Where are we going? I managed to stammer, but her only response was a giggle, that same off-putting sound that echoed in my mind like a warning bell. Stop, I wanted to shout, but each step took me deeper into the darkness of her world. We wandered into the attic, an old place filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and a window that barely let in any light. This is where they play, too, she said, hopping up and down with glee, her eyes sparkling unnaturally in the dim light. My heart sank into an endless pit as the thought of they made my skin crawl. Who plays? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. But before she could answer, she pointed dramatically at the far corner, and my eyes zeroed in on what appeared to be a dark, shifting mass. Just as I was about to react, I heard scratching coming from the other side of the room, a strange performance of whispers emerging from the shadows, like a disjointed chorus. Don't you want to meet them? Lily asked, her voice an inviting melody mixed with something sinister, her demeanor fully betraying the childlike innocence I had thought she possessed. Panic washed over me, catalyzing every instinct to flee from that attic, yet my feet felt rooted to the spot. I wanted to turn back, but curiosity gnawed at me, the way she spoke intertwined fear and intrigue. Lily, maybe we should go back downstairs, we can have our popcorn, I said weakly, but as I took a step back, the shadows began to stir, pulsing with a life of their own, the whispers rising into a frantic crescendo. Suddenly, a figure emerged, and it was not at all human, its limbs twisted grotesquely like the sketches on the floor, its eyes burning like embers, fixating on me, a predatory gaze that made my throat dry and heart pound louder than ever. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but it was as if the darkness in that attic held me captive. Lily's giggle echoed in the air, a manic blend of excitement and menace as she stepped toward the creature as if it were a long-lost friend, and I found the words escaping me, a tangled mess of terror strangling any sound. They like you, she urged, her eyes gleaming with mischief. They want to play. I fought with every ounce of my being to back away, but the darkness thickened around me, a tangible force that shackled my limbs frozen in fear. I could feel the cruelty of the shadows closing in. The realization washing over me that whatever those drawings were, whatever had happened in this house, it was reaching for me through Lily, through that wretched laughter, and the abomination that lurked at the edges of my vision. As I turned back toward the door, a scream clawed at my throat, forcing me to breathe in that musty stench of decay and darkness that had blanketed the room. Let me go, I cried out as I managed to find my voice, but Lily merely stared, tilting her head as if amused. With nearly a flick of her wrist, she commanded the creature, and its hollow eyes focused back on me. The insistence of that soft, sinister whisper crept back, wrapping around my mind, coaxing me to join them, to become part of whatever nightmare they existed in. My legs screamed to run, to break free, but as I turned to flee, I could swear I heard the chorus of laughter behind me blend into Lily's voice saying something I could never unhear, "You're part of the family now." As I burst from the attic, slamming the door shut behind me, my breaths came in ragged spurts, and I stumbled down the stairs, invading the silence of the living room with desperation. I could hear them following, the echoes of laughter growing closer, seeping through the slats of the attic door. I threw myself out of the front door without a second thought, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap as I fled into the darkness of the street, feeling tears stinging my eyes from the terror that simply wouldn't leave me alone. The sounds of the world outside felt all too foreign, but the relief of distance gave me a glimmer of hope. Just as I reached my own porch, a notification pinged into my pocket, pulling me back into the web of dread. Shaky, I pulled out my phone and opened WhatsApp, only to see a new message from Mrs. Patterson that sent chills spiraling down my spine. "I hope you're ready for an unforgettable night with her. You were chosen." For the past several weeks, I've noticed something strange about my garden hose. It seems to grow longer every day. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick played on me by the weariness of my workday-filled mind, but soon, I began to take measurement, coiling it up each evening only to find it unfurled more than it had the day before, creeping across the yard in a way that felt eerily deliberate. The lengths were small, hardly noticeable at first, an extra couple of inches here or there, but soon those increments turned into feet, dangling themselves around my azaleas and snaking up the fence, casting shadows in the twilight that made me feel like I wasn't the only person in the yard. My neighbor Sandra noticed, too, always peeking over the fence with a smirk as if she knew something I didn't. "A hose that grows? Better watch it or it might start watering your plants on its own," she teased, and I laughed nervously, brushing it off with a wave, but then I glanced over, and there it was, the hose, lying inexplicably longer than the day before, the black rubber ridges glistening in the afternoon sun like it was alive and waiting. One night, unable to shake a sense of dread, I woke at 3 a.m., drawn outside by a strange noise, a soft slithering, almost whisper-like, which made the hairs on my arms stand at attention. There it was, the hose, stretching and curling, as if it were searching for something, and in a bout of confusion and terror, I picked up the nearest tool, a small spade, and swung at the creeping rubber, but it simply lay there, unyielding, as I backed away, heart racing. Days went by and I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a result of the bizarre weather causing it to expand, but nothing made sense. It continued to grow longer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting, its end somehow reaching towards my house and the garden gnomes that stood like silent sentinels. The local hardware store owner, Hank, had a wild look in his eyes when I told him about the hose. "You know, they say some hoses are cursed," he whispered conspiratorially, casting furtive glances as if someone might overhear. I laughed it off nervously, but the unease settled deeper into my bones. With each passing night, I dreamt of the hose, vivid dreams where it coiled around my ankles, squeezing tighter with each futile attempt to escape, and when I woke, my legs would feel sore as though I had run for miles. As I tried to rationalize it, I stopped watering the garden entirely. That's when the hose seemed to grow at an alarming rate, spooling through my patio door and winding into my living room one evening while I was watching television, completely oblivious until the slithering began again, a soft rustle like whispers in the dark. Panic set in, and I yanked it back outside with my heart pounding, forcing it to obey, but what I didn't see was how the other end had now grown curious about the dark corners of my home. It disappeared into the shadows under my bed. I barricaded the door, terrified of what would happen if I fell asleep again, but sleep is a ruthless master. Fatigue pulled me in, and I found myself waking up again at 3 a.m., only this time the room was bathed in an odd shimmering light, and I felt its presence before I saw it. The hose snaked up the bedpost, larger than ever, glistening in phosphorescent green, and as it crept closer, I could hear faint whispers echoing softly, promising secrets untold. I tried to push it away, but it morphed, pulling tighter, squeezing the breath from my lungs while the whispers turned into frantic pleads, begging me to listen, to understand what they needed me to do. My mind frantically spun stories of ancient magic, predatory plants, of curses that came with home ownership and visions painted with blood. Who knows what horrors were woven through that twisted rubber. In a desperate act of survival, I reached for the closest thing, a half-empty bottle of soapy water, and sprayed it directly onto the hose, watching in disbelief as it began to sizzle like acid on flesh. The whispers turned into shrieks, and I felt its grip relax just long enough for me to tumble from the bed and sprint for the door, heart racing as I burst into the night air, where I collapsed on the grass, just heaving as I gasped for breath. As the dawn broke, I turned to look back at my home for one last time, and what I saw made me freeze in horror. My hose, now stretching towards the horizon, had nearly split the sky in half, writhing like a great serpent feeding on the sunlight, its whispers echoing through the breeze, urging me to return. I made my choice, and I ran, far away from that house and the increasingly hungry void it had become. Those who venture into my overgrown lawn just find an ordinary hose now, one which thankfully appears to have stopped growing, but at night, when the moon hangs low, I still hear the whispers, an endless echo that promises to find me again, waiting, just waiting. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when I received an inexplicable message on my phone: "I need you to babysit me. Be careful. Everything you do matters." At first, I thought it was a prank, perhaps a twisted joke from a friend, but the number was unrecognized, and the weight of the words drummed a quick rhythm in my heart that piqued my curiosity to a point of madness. After dismissing it, I turned back to my mundane life, but the message clung to me like a shroud, haunting that part of my mind where memories lay dormant. You see, I had always felt a sort of deep-rooted loneliness and regret from my childhood, trapped in the snarl of lost potential and nostalgia, so I decided it must be my younger self reaching out somehow, a mind-bending thought that ignited the whimsical part of me that missed the simplicity of youth. I rushed to my childhood home, that creaky relic of the past, and there I found a little boy sitting cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by toys, the remnants of my youth scattered in neat, vibrant piles. Time had woven a surreal tapestry as I stepped into that cramped space that had once been my oasis, and the boy's wide eyes caught mine with a flicker of recognition. a spark that set the room ablaze with memories long buried. I knelt beside him, asking who he was, only for him to shrug and reply in a voice too eerily familiar, "I'm you. Tomorrow, you won't remember any of this." An uncomfortable ache bloomed in my chest as the gravity of his words began to sink in, revealing a harsh truth I wished to deny. I was here, forced to confront the untamed, unbridled spirit I had once been but had long since crushed beneath the weight of adult expectations. I spent the day trying to engage with this vibrant creature who giggled like the world was a big, floppy blanket waiting to be wrapped around us, and we played games I had forgotten, like hide and seek, a game fraught with tension my older self had outgrown. Yet as I blinked, I felt that mix of nostalgia and terror, not knowing what awaited me each time I opened my eyes. It was exhilarating until the sun began to set, casting elongated shadows, and suddenly, the atmosphere transformed. The boy grew quiet, his face shadowed by something darker, a dreadful understanding that glimmered in his young eyes. "You didn't have to go back," he said softly, "but you chose to." My throat tightened as I grasped the eerie reality. I was in the presence of not only my memories but a vessel that housed my paradigm of failure, everything I had tucked away. A chill settled over me, and I asked him about our future, my voice barely a whisper. His small body trembled before he responded, "You were supposed to protect me, you know? You were supposed to brave the things that scared you." Fear clawed my insides as he started to coil like a serpent, tightening around the shadows of regret that I had amassed over the years. The dreadful silence engulfed us, punctuated only by creeping dread. As I felt the walls closing in, forcing me to acknowledge the fullness of time. "You're forgetting me," he said, tears pooling in those innocent eyes, and I felt the weight of anguish pressing down, a stark knot of guilt curling in my stomach. I couldn't help but recognize all the moments where I had let fear guide my decisions, where I had become someone so remorselessly pragmatic that I lost the courage I once had to dream. Suddenly, the room warped and shuddered, the images merging into a terrifying whir of colors and shapes that twisted my memories into grotesque portrayals, shoutouts from failed dreams, sounds of laughter morphed into mocking echoes. I realized the boy had become something altogether perilous, a wraith warning me that every moment I had squandered was peering at me through his vacant eyes. "You're not really supposed to be here," he hissed, his features stretching, and I trembled in horror as I felt the boundaries of my sanity seeping away, piecing together the very fabric of my existence that was unraveling before my eyes. I ran to escape, but those tiny hands grasped my shoulders, a vice tightening on my being, begging me to remember, spilling truths of lost opportunities and wrong turns. "You'll forget, they'll forget." The terrifying chant bubbled over, the world around me unspooled, until I locked eyes with him one last time and saw the flickering hint of the child I had been, desperate for safety and understanding, and then something clicked. In that blinding epiphany, I realized not only had I neglected the potential for courage in my choices but also the very essence of hope that this boy, my younger self, desperately craved. I finally managed to articulate the words, "I won't forget this, I promise." But the boy only smiled mournfully, and before I could grasp the conclusion of my revelation, the room slammed shut, light squashed from existence, and the echo of laughter twisted into screams as the chilling void swallowed us whole. When I awoke, it was morning and my eyes flew open to a sun pouring through the window. I was in my own bed, the breathing air heavy with familiarity yet tainted by an absence. There was no little boy, no toys scattered on the floor, only silence. No one could ever fathom the moments that had been reshaped, twisted, and lost in the void of possibilities nullified by apathy. I clutched my phone in a frantic haze, scrolling desperately to parse the last message, but it was gone. The once mysterious number had vanished like the memories I had now chosen to bury deep. I felt only emptiness where hope once existed, and instinctively, I turned to the mirror, catching a glimpse of a haunted visage that wore the remnants of awe and sorrow like a tattered coat. Each day rolled on as my spirit dimmed, moments where I could have taken a breath of adventure slipped into the die of a mundane cycle, relegated to boxes of routine, and still. In the quiet recesses of my mind, I sometimes feel a chill. When the sun sets just right, a fleeting whisper of laughter echoing faintly in the dimness, a haunting reminder that on that fateful day I had the chance to embrace the tremors of joy and fear, only to watch as my younger self faded, leaving behind a ravaging storm of what-ifs that will forever haunt me. My daughter has been doom-scrolling for 14 hours, and at this point, I can barely recognize her. Her wide, glassy eyes are glued to the screen, illuminated by the pale, flickering light of her phone as if it's the only thing tethering her to reality. I knew starting the day with that never-ending newsfeed was a mistake. The world outside had turned chaotic, but she insisted on staying connected, her mind convinced that scrolling through tragedy after tragedy could somehow empower her against the fear that brewed just beneath the surface. It began with just a few posts about the pandemic, then the political unrest, escalating into grim tales of violence, conspiracies that refused to die, and haunting videos of events that felt too surreal, too horrific to be real. I kept coming back to check on her, asking if she wanted to take a break, to come downstairs for dinner, to breathe air untainted by news, but each time my words hung in the air unanswered, as if she were lost in some deep, dark abyss of content that left her numb and unreachable. After hours of silence, I started to feel an unnerving chill as her laughter faded, replaced by the incessant scrolling, down, 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 like an endless rabbit hole pulling her further from me. I tried distracting stillness by muttering soft nonsense, hoping to pull her back to reality, each attempt met with a hollow stare that carried echoes of unearthly despair. It was as if her soul had been siphoned away, leaving behind a husk that resembled the daughter I used to know, but the light in her eyes was replaced by a lingering shadow of dread that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the notifications lighting up her screen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I snapped. I ripped the phone from her hands and held it high, ready to throw it against the wall like it was the harbinger of all our doom, but she leapt up, eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place: fear, rage, desperation? "You don't understand, Dad," she screamed, and for a brief moment, I flinched backward, recoiling from a voice I barely recognized. "You have to see what they're saying, it's all connected." I asked her to explain, but instead of words, she turned, her fingers tracing frantic pathways on an unseen screen, her breath hitching as though fighting back tears. I felt my heart quicken as she began murmuring things under her breath, almost in a trance. They know what's coming." With dread coiling inside my gut, I realized her feverish fingers were dancing over invisible keys, typing out secrets encoded only in her mind. "What's coming?" I pressed, shaken, and she looked at me, lost in yearning, as if she were attempting to bridge some unfathomable chasm between us, but before I could get an answer, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the house momentarily into darkness. When the electricity returned, her features were shadowed, and she seemed changed. The news feed now crawling beside her was a completely different story, reports of strange disappearances and unsettling patterns in towns across the country, but it wasn't until I heard the wailing on her phone, that eerie pitch that sounded like animals in distress, that I knew something deeply unsettling was taking place. "It's real, Dad. They're taking people, not just in the news but right outside, and they're playing games with us. They want to see how we react," she said with a gravity that chilled me to the bone, her hands beginning to shake as the screen displayed an ominous countdown. It was ticking downwards. The urge to gag at what she appeared to have discovered made it almost impossible to breathe. "You have to help me, we have to warn them." "Warn them about what?" I whispered, panic creeping into my voice, and as if echoing my thought, the countdown inched closer to a glowing red number 0. The items in the house echoed the tremors of my racing heart, shadows lengthening and stretching as the sense of impending dread pressed in around us, intensifying with each shudder of excitement that coursed through my daughter, her body vibrating like an unstrung instrument. I grabbed her shoulders, my fingers digging into her arms until her gaze met mine. "Please, listen to me." Just as I began to plead, a haunting siren pierced the night, reverberating off our walls, and that primal instinct took over. Fear spread like wildfire, turning in my stomach as she grew wide-eyed once more. "They're here," she gasped, and that's when I realized that my daughter had become an oracle of despair, ensnared by the unfurling horror around us, a bird caught in a web of her own making. I grabbed her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin chill, and for a fleeting moment, my resolve faltered against the crushing weight of her truth. The tension around us seemed to manifest into something tangible, something that wouldn't allow us a chance to escape, and all I could think was that we should have turned off that damn phone. Then, just as abruptly as the fear descended upon us, it began to melt away and an overwhelming sense of calm enveloped my daughter, her once frantic movements slowing into a serene stillness as she gazed back at the screen. It felt like she was entranced. I could feel the walls of my sanity start to buckle as I noticed the last post had a new message blinking ominously: "Welcome to the end," and at that moment, I understood that she was no longer just the audience, but perhaps the performer in a sinister game I couldn't even grasp. As the countdown hit 0, everything went quiet, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I would be grateful, but the house remained trapped in a hushed stillness that felt grotesque. My daughter turned to me, a slight smile creeping upon her lips, and with a voice softer than a whisper, said, "It's too late to warn them. They're ready now." And with that, the lights flickered once again, plunging the world into an uneasy dark, and in that moment, as the dread settled over us like a shroud, I knew I was no longer battling for my daughter's sanity. I was scrabbling against something much darker, something that was winning, and I could do nothing but watch as the nightmare unfolded. As a kid, my best friend David liked to boast about how easy it would be to get away with murder, tossing the words around with a glee that, at the time, I chalked up to the vivid imagination of a 12-year-old, but as I pulled my collar tighter against the fading autumn chill, with the echoes of our childhood playing in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe his words weren't merely playground bravado. We hadn't seen each other since high school, but the moment I heard that he was back in town, my heart raced. I was ecstatic, the kind of excitement that sparks nostalgia, but when we met at that familiar park, the laughter quickly faded away, replaced by something darker lurking beneath his smile. David had changed, he was colder, more calculating, and there was a gleam in his eye that sent shivers down my spine as he began talking about freedom and breaking free from the mundane. I tried to laugh it off, asking him how he had been, but he brushed aside my questions like leaves blown in the wind, respinning old tales about our childhood adventures, though this time, the punchlines were soaked in menace. Then he leaned in close, and in a hushed tone that sent my heart into a frenzy, he said, "You know, if you're smart, no one would ever have to know." I laughed nervously, expecting a punchline, but instead, his expression grew serious, and he recounted stories of people disappearing, like that girl from the next neighborhood who vanished years ago, her case left cold like the winter air that had settled in. "They never found her, didn't even really look for her," he said thoughtfully, his eyes dark, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if he was reflecting on the girl or something else entirely. Time slipped away as we reminisced, or rather, he enthralled me with tales that felt deceptively innocent but took a sinister turn when he described a place deep in the woods where he claimed no one goes, a hideout perfect for temporary disappearances. I laughed again, trying to shake the unease, but David leaned closer, and his whisper carried a weight that suffocated me. "You and I could make a pact, you know. Do something no one would expect. Something extraordinary." I wanted to excuse myself, make some excuse about a pressing appointment, but his grip tightened around my wrist, and the warmth left on my skin felt like a chain rather than a friendly gesture. The shadows of the trees loomed over us like uninvited witnesses, and his words dripped with a dark charisma that I couldn't resist, pulling me deeper into a web I didn't want to be part of. Those childhood memories began to replay vividly, a time when we were invincible and believed the world was ours. Now, however, those memories felt like shackles rather than wings, and I could almost taste the iron tang of fear in the air when I stepped back, attempting to disentangle myself from his grasp. But he was relentless, regaling me with gruesome stories of local legends mixed with dripping sarcasm and strange humor, taunting me with ideas of slipping through the cracks where no one would look while the walls of my sanity began crumbling down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the whole park in eerie twilight, I could feel the tension thickening. It was no longer the nostalgia-filled reunion I'd dreamed of but a capturing of the blood-soaked fantasies that once resided only in David's mind. His voice, sharp like a dagger, hinted at something terrifying. It felt like I was opening Pandora's box, and no amount of rational thought could halt the surge of dread and curiosity that danced wickedly within me. The air felt charged, and suddenly I remembered the girl, the missing girl, and the lingering questions in the back of my mind began to surface. I wondered if he had ever crossed that line, that forbidden border we had joked about in hushed whispers beneath our sheets back then. Before I could fully understand what was happening, he darted a glance toward the path that led deeper into the woods, suggesting we go there, the excitement in his eyes flaring to life like flames ready to scorch. Conflicted, my heart raced as thoughts whirled through my mind. Was I really about to entertain this? Shouldn't I have laughed it off and sputtered something about being adults now? I pulled away, instinctively heading toward my car parked nearby, but David's hand shot out to catch mine, his face hungry for a darkness that intrigued and terrified me all at once. "You'll see, Travis. It's just a little adventure," he whispered, his tone light and unnervingly cheerful, as if he were merely offering me a quick thrill. I could almost hear the laughter from our past echoing in the distance, but as I looked into his eyes, I saw something else entirely, a vacuum sucking the light away, a hunger for chaos that left me trembling with fear. Torn between the allure of my childhood friend's twisted invitation and the instinct to escape, I cracked, agreeing to follow him into that foreboding grove, the woods swallowing us in shadows that danced like specters around us. Heart pounding, dread coiling in my stomach, we trekked into the dark, David navigating through the trees as though he had traversed this route countless times, laughter spilling from his lips intermittently when I stumbled over roots and rocks hidden in the undergrowth. And then we arrived, the clearing, the spot he had described where no one ever came, an intensity in the atmosphere that felt alive, vibrating with untold stories. My primal instincts screamed for me to turn back, but that childhood bond flickered to life, pulling me near despite the rising panic in my chest. Time slipped into a surreal realm as David pulled out a small kit from his backpack, casual and poised as he set it down on the ground like it was a picnic rather than the precursor to a dark abyss. "You know what they say about freedom?" he remarked, his voice almost sing-song, but behind the facade lay a seriousness that rattled through my bones. I watched as he meticulously arranged items, a knife glinting menacingly in the dying light, zip ties, and a small lock of hair he'd hidden away in a precious locket he had pulled from his pocket. Reality landed like a ton of bricks, and as the weight of our shared silence settled, the echoes of our youth faded to nothing, replaced by the chilling realization that David had transformed into something monstrous, and I was but a breath away from crossing a line I could never uncross. Panic surged, and at that moment, I broke away, heart racing as I sprinted back through the woods, branches threatening to claw at my skin, his laughter ringing behind me, echoing through the trees, a mockery of my desperate need to escape. I could feel his presence pressing against me, a shadow, a predator pursuing prey, the warmth of that dark thrill threatening to engulf me as I stumbled my way back into the park. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in a frantic daze, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I locked the doors and burst into tears. What had I just witnessed? Was he serious? Would I wake up tomorrow to news reports of a crime I was unwittingly tied to? My mind raced with horrific possibilities as I sped away from that park, miles passing under the tires of my car, the taste of his laughter still fresh on my tongue. It's been weeks since I last saw David, but every day I checked the news, fear clawing at my gut that one day I might see his face among some sordid headline. Friends have all said I should reach out, that it's just nostalgia binding me to him, but as I lie awake at night, my thoughts repeatedly echo David's words, "If you're smart, no one would ever have to know." He wasn't just boasting. As the shadows deepen, and the lines of reality blur, I can't help but wonder, is it only a matter of time before he comes for me next? I can still hear the thudding of my heart against my ribs as I stood outside the cafe, the sun still warm on my skin, but I felt cold as if the air had turned to ice around me. I had known about the affair for months, the subtle changes in John's behavior, the late nights at work that became too conspicuous, the text messages he forgot to delete. Each was a link in a chain I had pieced together, heavy and unrepentant. But knowing was different from confronting, and that day, I wasn't just confronting John. I was here to confront the girl, the woman who had shackled my marriage with her treachery. I spotted her through the window, a girl in her mid-20s, light blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, laughing too easily as she twirled a strand around her finger. How naive she appeared. My hands were clammy, my breaths shallow and quick. But there was a strange calmness settling within me as I pushed through the cafe door, a soft chime announcing my arrival. She turned, laughter evaporating as confusion washed over her face, and I stood there, feeling like an uninvited guest at a party meant for lovers. "You're here," she managed, and it sent a wave of bile crawling up my throat. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, forcing her to see the hurt in my eyes, the betrayal in the lines of my frowning mouth. "I need to talk to you. About John." The way her face paled, the spark of alarm that ignited in her baby blue eyes only fueled my anger. Here was someone who had wrecked my home, brought shards of glass into my life as if it were an amusement. I saw it all unravel before me in bright flashes, the days spent alone, trying to pretend that everything was fine, the smiles that no longer reached my eyes, and the aching loneliness that settled in my bones worse than winter's chill. "I know what you've done," I said, my voice steady but strained, and she opened her mouth to object. But I pressed on. "You think this is some romantic affair? You're just as much a victim as I am, you're just too stupid to realize it." Confusion morphed into defensiveness, and suddenly she was rising from her seat like a storm. "You don't know anything," she spat, "you don't know us." But I did know, I knew too much, about her laugh, her cheap perfume, the way she would steal my husband away from me. You think he loves you? I laughed dryly, letting every ounce of my hurt become part of that bitter sound. He doesn't love you, he's just drawn to the excitement, the newness. You're a distraction, nothing more. You'll be discarded once he's done. The flicker of uncertainty betrayed her posture for just a moment, but then she seemed to regain her composure, the bravado of a petulant child, and I could see the steeliness behind her facade as she snapped back. You're just jealous. He told me he was unhappy with you, that you weren't enough. The words hit like a physical blow, and it felt as though someone had driven a knife into my gut, twisting it maliciously, but I wasn't going to crumble. I took a step forward, letting the cafe fade from my awareness, the burden of her presence too much to bear. I may not be enough for him, but you'll never be enough for him either. He'll always come back to me, and you will always be the other woman. The resulting silence in the cafe was thick, suffocating, save for the muffled clinking of dishes and faint chatter around us. It was then I recognized the fire in her eyes had turned to despair, a flicker of doubt cracking the glossy surface of her confidence. You don't mean that, she whispered, her bravado faltering, while my anger melted into something else, uncertainty, fear. What if she was right? What if John truly desired her? But I shook the thought away. I knew what love was, more than a fleeting desire, more than just lust. After what felt like an eternity, I decided it was time to expose the truth behind her false security. You don't realize what you're playing with, do you? I began, each word dripping with disdain. You think you've won him over, but in time you'll awaken something feral, something in him that will consume you whole. Her facade cracked further. What do you mean? She asked, genuine fear creeping into her tone. I took a moment to savor this, relishing the realization settling in, the power shifting as the words escaped me. He's not who you think he is, I said, and I watched as the color drained from her face. You see the charming husband, the devoted father, you see a facade. But behind that smile lies a darkness, a shadow he hasn't allowed anyone to witness. Her breath quickened, and for a fleeting moment, we were no longer adversaries trapped in this twisted game. We were two women caught in the web of a man who manipulated us both. With that haunting image firmly planted in our minds, I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a whisper that only she could hear. He won't keep you safe. The man you're falling for hides a rage capable of devastating anyone who gets too close. I've seen it, I've experienced it. He isn't just sweet and charming, he is a monster wearing a mask. I didn't need to look in her eyes to see the panic spiraling within her. I could almost taste the anxiety bubbling in the air between us. The truth was toxic, and I reveled in the chance to divulge it. You can have him, but don't expect him to play the role you want him to. He'll pull the rug from under your feet, and when you're falling, you'll see his true self, a fractured soul steeped in darkness, claiming those around him as mere pawns. The tremor in her hands was now visible, a visible testament to the dawning realization of my words, and just to drive my point home, I concluded, you've been warned. And with that, I turned and pushed through the cafe doors, the air cool against my flushed face, suddenly needing to escape the weight of the moment. But as I stepped into the street, a chilling laughter echoed behind me, a laughter that was all too familiar. It was John's. Looking back, heart racing again, I saw him approach, clutching a bouquet of flowers, the kind he used to bring me before the affair tainted our love. Darling. He called out to me, and his voice sank into my skin like icy fingers. I thought we could celebrate tonight. But I couldn't process his words, the air thick as realization dawned. This time, his eyes didn't dance with light, they held a malevolent glimmer in the setting sun. I stumbled back, horrified, and that dreadful laughter hung in the air like a dark omen. Somehow, I knew, deep down, that this wasn't about love anymore. It had shifted into a game of manipulation and power. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through me, and I took off, my feet pounding against the pavement, desperate to escape, not just the man I once loved, but the creature that had emerged, hungry for destruction.